He didn't knock. That was the first thing anyone noticed about Gideon Voss. He never knocked. He walked through the front gate of Black Hollow Ranch on a Tuesday morning in November, like the land already belonged to him, his boots crunching over frost-hardened ground, two men behind him carrying surveying equipment they hadn't been asked to bring. He stopped in the middle of the yard, looked at the main house, looked at the barn, looked at the dry creek bed running along the western edge of the property, and he smiled. Not at anyone in particular. Just smiled at the land, the way a man smiles at something he's already decided to take. He pulled a folded paper from his coat pocket and held it up without saying a word. "Water agreement," he announced, loud enough for 3 cowboys, leaning against the fence to hear. "Your operation needs water. I'm offering access through my northern channel. Fair terms. Reasonable time frame." He paused. "Or you can keep watching that creek bed dry up and see how long this ranch holds together without it." Nobody answered him. Nobody knew what to say. Nobody, except the woman standing just inside the kitchen doorway, flour on her hands, watching him through the gap in the frame, a woman who had been at Black Hollow Ranch exactly 11 days, who had survived worse than men with folded papers and confident smiles, and who understood, in the precise moment she watched Gideon Voss study the western creek bed, exactly what he was actually offering. It wasn't help. It was the first move in a plan to swallow the ranch whole. If you've ever watched someone try to take something from a person who had nothing left to lose, you already know how this story goes. Stay with me, because this one doesn't go the way anyone expected. This story speaks to you if you've ever been underestimated, overlooked, or told you don't belong somewhere you know in your bones. You do subscribe to this channel before we go any further. Hit that like button, and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to know how far this story travels, because I think it's going to go a long way. Now, let's go back 11 days. Mara Ellison arrived at Black Hollow Ranch on a Monday. Came by wagon, which wasn't unusual. What was unusual was that she came alone, no husband, no chaperone, no letter of introduction from anyone who mattered in Casper or Laramie or any of the towns between here and wherever she'd started. She had one trunk, one canvas bag, and a folded advertisement she'd torn from a bulletin board in a train station 3 weeks earlier. Cook needed. Black Hollow Ranch, Powder River Basin. Room and meals provided. Honest wage for honest work. Inquire Cassidy, foreman. She'd read it 4 times before she took it down. Then she'd folded it into her coat pocket, walked to the livery, arranged passage on a supply wagon heading north, and didn't look back at the town she was leaving. She wasn't running from something exactly. She was done waiting for something better to arrive on its own. The driver who brought her a wide man named Holt, who chewed tobacco and spoke approximately 40 words in the 3-hour ride, left her at the gate without offering to carry her trunk. She didn't ask him to. She pulled it out herself, set it in the frozen mud, and stood for a moment looking at the property in front of her. Black Hollow Ranch was not what the advertisement suggested. It wasn't a disaster exactly, but it was close. The main house needed paint badly enough that the original color was anyone's guess. One of the fence sections along the eastern pasture had been repaired with what appeared to be rope and mismatched planks. The barn was solid, that much she could tell, but the outbuildings had the look of structures waiting for one more hard winter to finish them off. The yard was clean enough, which meant someone cared, but there were signs everywhere of deferred maintenance, of problems patched and postponed rather than solved. She picked up her trunk and walked toward the main house. A man came out onto the porch before she reached the steps. Late 40s, sunburned face, a permanent squint from years of looking at horizons. He had the posture of someone who'd spent his life outdoors, and the expression of someone currently indoors, dealing with administrative problems he hadn't signed up for. "You're the woman from the advertisement," he said. "Mara Ellison." She set the trunk down at the base of the steps and extended her hand. He looked at the hand for half a second, not rudely, just slightly surprised, then shook it. "Walt Cassidy, foreman." He looked her over, not unkindly, but with the frank assessment of a man trying to determine if someone could handle physical work. "You cook?" "I cook. Professionally? Long enough that I stopped counting the years." He made a sound that wasn't quite a grunt and wasn't quite approval. "Kitchen's in rough shape. We had a cook who left in September. Man before him lasted 6 weeks. The stove's got a problem I haven't had time to diagnose, and we're running low on several basics." "I'll need an inventory," Mara said. He blinked. "What?" "A full inventory of what's in the pantry and the root cellar, if there is one, and access to the kitchen alone for the first hour." I work better when I can see a problem clearly before anyone tells me what they think the problem is. Cassidy stared at her for a moment. Then something shifted slightly in his expression. Not warmth, exactly, but a recalibration. There's a root cellar. I'll get you a lantern. Kitchen was worse than he'd described. Not unusable. Close. The stove had a cracked firebox seal. She found it in the first 10 minutes, running her hand along the iron until she felt the cold air seeping in where it shouldn't. That explained why it burned through wood faster than it should, and still couldn't maintain heat. The remedy wasn't complex, but it required materials she'd need to locate. The pantry was genuinely low: flour, salt, dried beans, some cured pork that was still good, but not for much longer, 2 sacks of cornmeal, a tin of lard, not nothing, but not comfortable either. The root cellar was better. Someone had put up preserves, though she couldn't tell who or when the jars were unlabeled, which told her no one had been keeping proper records. There were potatoes, not many but some, dried apples, crock of something that turned out, when she pried the lid, to be pickled cabbage in reasonable condition. She sat on an overturned crate in the root cellar, with a stub of pencil and the back of an old feed receipt, and wrote down everything she could see. Then she went back upstairs and asked Cassidy for the storage records. He looked at her like she'd asked for a map to the moon. "We don't exactly keep—" "That's fine," she said. "I'll start from what I found." She spent the rest of that first day establishing a baseline, not cooking assessing. When the men came in for supper expecting something, she gave them beans and cornbread and salt pork, nothing complicated, and she watched them eat it and watched how they watched her. There were 7 of them at the table. 6 didn't look at her at all except to check if the pot was empty. 1 did. He was sitting at the far end, not because he'd chosen the least prominent seat, but because that was where he'd ended up, and he didn't seem to care much either way. Medium build, maybe mid-30s, with the kind of face that was hard to read because it was simply quiet, not guarded, not closed off, just genuinely still. He ate without complaint, which most of them did, but he ate without the performative indifference the others were broadcasting in her direction. He just ate. When she refilled the bread basket, she noticed he'd been reading something. He put it away before she got close. She didn't mention it. That night, alone in the small room off the kitchen that was apparently hers, she lay on a narrow cot and looked at the ceiling and calculated how much food was available, how long it would last, what she'd need to do to extend it, what the kitchen needed to function properly, what the ranch itself was missing that she could already see after one day. She didn't sleep much. She never did when there was a problem she hadn't finished mapping. By the end of the first week, she had reorganized the pantry, repaired the firebox seal with a clay compound she'd made from materials she found in the equipment shed, established a cooking schedule that stretched the existing supplies without making anyone feel like they were being rationed, and learned the name of every man on the property. The 6 who'd ignored her: Pete, a thick-necked senior hand who'd been there longer than anyone, and treated the kitchen as a dispensary rather than someone's workspace. Donovan and Ferris, 2 younger men who worked together and finished each other's sentences. Old Roy, who was probably 60 and moved like he was 80 but still put in full days without complaint. A man everyone called Skeeter for reasons no one would explain. And a newer hand named Jeb, who was maybe 19 and deeply uncertain about everything. Quiet one at the end of the table was Caleb Rourke. She learned his name not because he introduced himself, but because she overheard Cassidy speak to him on the second morning, giving him a task in a tone slightly different from the one he used with the others. Not deferential, exactly, but thoughtful, like he was making a request rather than issuing an order. Caleb came by the kitchen on the 3rd day, not during a meal, mid-afternoon, and knocked on the doorframe before stepping in. That alone separated him from everyone else, who walked in and out like the kitchen was a thoroughfare. "You're looking at the water line," he said. She was. She'd found the pipe that fed water into the kitchen had a slow leak somewhere in the wall, and she'd been tracing it by checking the dampness of the plaster. Turned around. "It's losing pressure." "Yeah." He came closer and looked at the wall she'd been studying. "Roy patched it last spring. Didn't hold. Do you know where the line runs?" "Thought about it. I can show you the main valve. The run from there to here goes under the floor mostly." "Is there a diagram somewhere?" "A drawing of how the property's water system works." He looked at her with the same quiet assessment she was beginning to recognize as his default mode. Not suspicious, not dismissive, just taking her measure. "There's papers in the office. Old ones. I don't know how complete they are. Can you get them for me? He was quiet for a moment. I'll look. He brought them that evening. A rolled set of hand-drawn diagrams. Some of them faded, some of them clearly amended by different hands over the years. She spread them on the kitchen table and spent an hour going through them while the evening light held, and what she found was interesting enough that she forgot to start supper until Skeeter knocked on the doorframe with an expression of anxious hope. The water system on this property was more extensive than anyone seemed to know. There were irrigation channels marked on the older diagrams that didn't appear on the newer ones, not because they'd been removed, but because they'd apparently been forgotten. One of them ran along the eastern pasture. Another connected the main water source, a spring on the northwestern edge of the property, to a secondary holding pond she hadn't seen yet. She noted all of it and said nothing. On the 8th day, Pete walked into the kitchen while she was working and picked up a jar from the shelf without asking. That's accounted for, she said without turning around. He stopped. What, the jar? I have it in the inventory. If you're taking it out of the pantry, I need to know so the count stays accurate. There was a pause. She turned around. Pete was looking at her with an expression she'd seen before on men who'd decided they were about to have a problem with her. I've been working this ranch for 9 years, he said. I don't ask permission to take something from a shelf. You're not asking permission, Mara said evenly. I'm asking you to tell me what you take. There's a difference, is there? Yes. One is about authority and one is about information. I'm not trying to manage you. I'm trying to manage the supplies. If I don't know what's leaving the pantry, I can't tell you how long we have before we run out of things. He set the jar down with more force than was necessary. We had a cook before you. He didn't count things. That might be part of why you ran short last month. His jaw tightened. She held his gaze and didn't move and didn't soften anything in her expression. She wasn't trying to provoke him. She was just being precise. He left without the jar. She exhaled slowly through her nose, put the jar back in its place on the shelf, and went back to work. Her hands had been steady throughout. That was something. Caleb Rourke found her the next morning at the eastern fence line. She'd been up before light, which had been her habit her whole life, and she'd gone out to walk the fence along the eastern pasture, looking for the irrigation channel marked on the old diagrams. She'd found it, or rather, found where it had been. The channel itself was choked with years of debris, grass and silt, and collapsed sections of the earthen bank. But the basic shape of it was still visible if you knew what you were looking for. She was crouching down, examining a section where the ground was lower than the surrounding area, when she heard boots in the frost behind her. She stood and turned. Caleb stopped about 6 feet away, breath visible in the cold air. Early, they said. Couldn't sleep. He looked at the ground where she'd been crouching, then at the fence line. He seemed to understand immediately what she'd found. That's the old East Channel. There's another one, she said, on the diagrams, connecting the spring to a secondary pond. Do you know if it still exists? He was quiet for a moment. Not evasive, she was learning the difference. He was someone who didn't speak until he'd thought about what he was going to say. I've seen the pond. Northwest corner past the standing rocks. It's dry. But it's there. It's there. She looked back at the choked channel. If these were cleared and the spring connection was restored, how much of the east pasture could be irrigated? He was quiet again. Longer this time, most of it. She nodded, said nothing else. They stood there for a moment, both looking at the same strip of dead earth, both thinking about what it could be. You want to tell me why you're out here figuring out the water system, Caleb said, and not just cooking? To look at him. He met her gaze with the same steadiness he brought to everything. She considered the question not whether to answer, but how much to say. Because someone has to, she said. He didn't push further. They walked back toward the barn in the early gray light, not quite together and not quite separate. And somewhere in that walk, she decided Caleb Rourke was one of the more honest people she'd encountered in a long time, though she couldn't have said exactly why. It was 2 days later that Gideon Voss arrived. She saw him come through the gate. She was in the kitchen doorway letting the heat out, which she didn't like to do, but she'd needed a breath of cold air after 2 hours over the stove. She watched him walk across the yard with his surveyors and his folded paper and his smile that wasn't aimed at anyone, and she felt something in her chest go absolutely still. She knew that type of man. Not Gideon Voss specifically, she'd never met him, but the category of man he represented. She'd seen it in her father's face the morning he'd explained why they were losing the house. She'd seen it in the face of the man who'd bought her father's tools at auction for a third of what they were worth. Men who moved through the world with the calm certainty that things would arrange themselves in their favor, because things generally had. She dried her hands on her apron and stayed in the doorway. She heard Voss deliver his pitch to Cassidy, who'd come out of the barn at the sound of boots on frozen ground. She heard the words water agreement and fair terms and reasonable time frame. She watched Cassidy's face, which was doing the thing faces did when someone was being given an offer that sounded reasonable and felt completely wrong. She looked at the western edge of the property, at the creek bed Voss had smiled at. Then she looked at the old diagrams in her memory, the detailed hand-drawn lines she'd spent an hour studying by evening light, and she thought about where the ranch's spring was located, northwestern corner, and where Gideon Voss's property sat, according to everything she'd been able to gather from conversations she'd listened to carefully without appearing to listen. She thought about the secondary pond, the choked irrigation channels, the spring that still ran. She was certain of it, that everyone at Black Hollow Ranch seemed to have forgotten about. Voss was holding up that folded paper and explaining what it contained, and Cassidy was reading it with the expression of a man who couldn't afford a lawyer and knew it, and the 6 cowboys were watching with the grim patience of men who understood that whatever happened next was going to fall on them somehow. Mara stepped back into the kitchen. She picked up her pencil and her inventory sheet, turned it over to the blank side, and started writing down everything she knew about the water on this property. Everything she'd seen in the diagrams. Every conversation she'd replayed in her mind. Everything Caleb had told her without realizing how much he was telling her. She wrote for 20 minutes without stopping. When Cassidy came in for the midday meal, she was at the stove, and the papers were folded back into her apron pocket, and nothing in her expression told him anything about what she'd figured out. But she'd figured out all of it. Cassidy told the men about Voss's offer that evening at supper. He laid it out plainly. The ranch needed reliable water access. The creek was unreliable in drought years. Voss was offering a channel connection that would solve the problem. The terms weren't terrible, and he needed them to understand what was being considered. Pete said it sounded reasonable. Donovan and Ferris exchanged a look that said they'd follow wherever Pete led. Old Roy said nothing, which he usually did. Skeeter asked how much it cost. Jeb looked at his plate. Caleb said, "What does he want in return?" Cassidy hesitated. "Access easement along the northern boundary." "How wide?" "Paper says 40 feet. Caleb was quiet for a moment. "That's a road." Another pause. "Could be used as one." "Yeah." Caleb set his fork down. Not dramatically. Just put it on the table and sat back slightly. "That puts his access right up against the spring." The table went quiet. Even Pete, who'd been nodding along, stopped nodding. Mara was standing at the stove with her back to them, and she did not turn around, and she did not say anything. She listened to the silence that followed Caleb's observation, and felt it confirm everything she'd already concluded. "Well," Cassidy said finally, in the voice of a man who hadn't thought it through quite that far, "it's just access for his cattle to the northern channel. It doesn't give him rights to the spring." "No," Caleb said. "Not in the first agreement." Nobody answered that. The word first sat in the middle of the table, like something none of them had words for. Mara served the rest of supper without comment. But that night, after the men had gone to their bunks and the fire had burned down to coals, she lit a candle at the kitchen table and spread out the old water diagrams Caleb had found for her and studied them for 2 hours. She wasn't sure what she was going to do yet. She wasn't sure what she could do. She was a cook, officially, with no legal standing on the property and no particular claim to anyone's attention. But she was also the only person in Black Hollow Ranch who had read every line of those diagrams, who had walked the eastern fence before sunrise, who had found the secondary pond on a map and planned to find it in person, who had noticed that the creek bed Gideon Voss had smiled at was on the western edge of the property, and the spring feeding everything was on the northwestern edge, and the difference between those two directions mattered enormously. She folded the diagrams carefully, tucked them into her trunk under the spare blanket. Then she sat back down at the table in the near dark and ate the cold supper she'd forgotten to eat while it was warm, thinking through a problem she hadn't been asked to solve for a ranch that wasn't hers, in a territory where nobody had yet asked her what she thought about anything. Chewed slowly, thought clearly. The water was the whole thing. Voss knew it. Caleb half knew it. Cassidy suspected it, but hadn't had time to map it out. And now Mara knew it too. The following morning, she asked Cassidy, as casually as she could manage, if there was a claims record anywhere, a property document or deed record that described the boundaries of the ranch's water rights. He looked at her for a long moment. Why? I'm trying to understand the property, she said. If I know what resources are available, I can plan better for difficult seasons. It was true as far as it went. He rubbed the back of his neck. There's a box in the office. I haven't looked through it in a while. Old documents from when the ranch was first registered. Could I look through it? Why do you need... I'll tell you if I find anything that matters, she said. It was a small promise directly made, and Cassidy seemed to decide it was enough. He brought her the box that afternoon. It was a wooden crate that smelled of dust and old paper, and it was full of exactly the kind of documents she'd been hoping for. Registration records, boundary surveys, water rights filings going back to the original claim. She went through every page. What she found took her breath away, not with surprise, exactly, but with the specific, quiet shock of having a theory confirmed. Spring on the northwestern corner of the property was registered to Black Hollow Ranch under a territorial water rights filing dated 1874. The registration was clear, specific, and legally recorded. Described not just the spring itself, but the natural flow paths extending from it, which included, in language that was somewhat archaic but unmistakable, the secondary channel running to the holding pond and the eastern irrigation system. Gideon Voss's proposed easement would run his access road directly alongside the registered spring boundary. If he controlled that road, if his cattle moved along that corridor, if his workers passed through it regularly, if he established use of it, a lawyer clever enough could argue that the boundary had been blurred, that the easement had become something more, that the spring's access was no longer exclusively Black Hollow's. She'd seen it done. Different property, different state, different decade, but the method was identical. You didn't steal water outright in Wyoming territory. You borrowed access. Then you borrowed a little more. Then one day the documents all said something different from what they used to say, and by then it was too late to argue about it. She sat in the office for a long time after she'd finished reading. Then she put everything back in the box in the same order she'd found it, added her own set of notes at the bottom, written in clear, organized detail, and carried the box back to Cassidy. Anything useful? He asked. The water rights documents are complete, she said. The spring registration is solid. The ranch has a stronger legal position than Voss's offer suggests. Cassidy stared at her. How do you know what a water rights registration looks like? She'd been waiting for that question. My father had a farm. He lost it, partly because he didn't understand the documents he'd signed. I learned to read them afterward. She paused. It's the kind of thing you learn after it costs you something. Cassidy was quiet for a moment, not uncomfortable, thoughtful. The expression of a man recalibrating again. You're saying we should turn down Voss's offer. I'm saying you should understand what you're giving up before you agree to give it up. He sat down heavily in the office chair. We need water access. You have water access. You have a spring. You have filing documents from 1874 that nobody in this county is going to challenge, unless someone gives them a reason to. She looked at him steadily. Eastern irrigation channels were blocked up years ago, and everyone forgot about them. They were cleared. Your east pasture would have water through dry season without needing Voss or anyone else. There was a long silence. That's months of work, Cassidy said. Probably yes. We don't have the men for a project like that during winter. Not all at once, she said, but a section at a time. He was staring at the box of documents, like he was trying to read through the wood. How do you know all this? You've been here 11 days. I've been paying attention for 11 days, she said. That's usually enough. She expected him to dismiss it, or table it, or say he'd think about it, which generally meant the same thing. Instead, Cassidy stood up, picked up the box, and said, I'm going to need to look at those documents myself. Carefully. There's a note at the bottom, she said. I wrote down the relevant filing numbers and the exact language about the spring access rights. It might help you find what you're looking for faster. He looked at her again, with that expression she was learning to read. Not gratitude exactly. Something more complicated. The face of a man who'd been managing an impossible situation alone for a long time, and who had not expected help to walk in looking like it did. Thank you, he said. Simple and direct. She went back to the kitchen. That evening at supper, she noticed that Caleb was watching her from the end of the table, with the same quiet attention he'd had from the first night, except that now it carried something else in it. Couldn't quite name what it was. Awareness, maybe. The particular stillness of someone who had put something together that he hadn't quite expected to put together. She didn't look back at him for more than a second. She served the meal and went back to the stove and stood there long enough to feel the heat soak into her tired hands. And she thought about the irrigation channels clogged with years of debris, and the spring in the northwest corner, and the secondary pond waiting to be filled again. She thought about the creek bed Gideon Voss had smiled at. She thought, he has no idea what's already here. And for the first time since she'd stepped off that wagon 11 days ago, she felt something that was close to steady. Not comfort, she wasn't comfortable, wasn't close to it, but the particular kind of solid that comes from understanding a situation clearly and knowing that understanding is worth something. She heard Cassidy's voice from the table, telling the men he was going to decline Voss's offer for now, that he wanted to look more carefully at their own resources before they agreed to anything. Pete's voice rough with skepticism, that's a risk. Cassidy's response, quieter but firm, everything's a risk, Pete. Some risks are just better understood than others. Kitchen was warm. Outside, the temperature was dropping, the way it did at altitude when the season had made up its mind. Somewhere in the northwest corner of the property, past the standing rocks Caleb had mentioned, there was a holding pond she'd never seen that might be the key to everything. Tomorrow, she decided. She'd find it tomorrow. She was only a cook, but she was also, it turned out, the most attentive person on this property, and in Wyoming territory in November, with winter closing in, and a man like Gideon Voss circling the fence line. Attentive was worth more than anyone here had thought to value. Yet, she found the pond the next morning. It took her longer than she'd expected. The northwest corner of the property was rougher terrain than the diagrams suggested, all broken rock and frozen scrub brush, and she'd miscalculated the distance from the standing rocks. Caleb had mentioned by about a quarter mile. She was cold by the time she reached it, her boots soaked through from a section of ground that had looked solid and wasn't, and her hands were stiff enough that she'd had trouble keeping her pencil working. There it was. The holding pond wasn't much to look at. A roughly oval depression in the land, maybe 60 feet across at its widest, with cracked earth at the bottom where water had once sat, and a fringe of dead cattails around the lower edges. The earthen berm that formed the southern wall was still intact, which was more than she'd hoped, and the inlet channel from the northwest from the direction of the spring was visible, choked with debris the way the eastern channels were choked. But there, unmistakably there, she stood at the edge of the empty pond for a while, breath clouding in the cold air, and looked at it. This was not a dead thing. It was a sleeping thing. There was a difference, and the difference mattered. She sketched the pond and the surrounding terrain in her notebook, measured the berm by walking its length, and noted where the inlet channel was worst obstructed. Then she walked back to the ranch, changed her boots, and started breakfast 40 minutes later than she'd intended. Nobody mentioned it, or if they noticed, they didn't say so to her face. Cassidy came to find her that afternoon. She was in the middle of rendering lard for the week, which was not a task that welcomed interruption, but she could tell from the way he stood in the doorway that whatever he'd come to say was going to be said, regardless. She kept working. "I looked at the documents," he said. "And the water rights filing is what you said it was." He paused. "I also looked at Voss's proposed easement again, the one he brought. What did you find?" "That strip he wants runs within 30 feet of the spring access point." He said it flatly, like he was reporting a fact he wasn't happy about. "If his cattle are grazing that corridor and his men are running fence posts along it, we'd have a devil of a time arguing the spring access was exclusive." Mara didn't say I know. She just said yes. He came further into the kitchen and sat down on the bench by the wall, which she'd never seen him do before. He was a man who stood. Watching him sit told her he was more tired than usual, or more unsettled, or both. "He's going to come back," Cassidy said. "He will. And when he does, he's not going to take a polite no very well. Men like Voss usually don't." Cassidy rubbed his face with both hands, which was a gesture she recognized her father had done it when the numbers stopped adding up. "I don't have the resources to fight a legal battle. Even if we're in the right, lawyers cost money, and a man like Voss has more of it than we do." "The best defense against a legal battle," Mara said carefully, "is documentation so complete that there's nothing to fight about." He looked up. "Meaning what?" "Meaning if every boundary marker is recorded, if every water right is filed correctly, if there's a dated record of how this ranch has used its water for the past 20 years, then there's no ambiguity for a lawyer to work with." She set down her spoon and turned to face him properly. Does the ranch have current boundary surveys? The last one was, he stopped. 1882, I think. That's 8 years ago. Surveying costs money too. I know, she thought for a moment. The old survey would still hold legally unless Voss can demonstrate a boundary dispute, which means as long as we can document that the ranch has consistently treated the spring access as exclusive, that we've maintained the channels, used the water, kept the pond, the legal position is strong. Cassidy was looking at her, the way he'd been looking at her more and more frequently, like he was trying to figure out where she'd come from and what she was doing in his kitchen. Pond's empty, he said. The channels are blocked. That's not consistent use. Not yet, Mara said. There was a short silence. How long would it take, he said slowly, to clear those channels? The eastern section? 4 men, 2 weeks, maybe less if the ground cooperates. She paused. Inlet to the pond would be a separate project. Smaller, maybe 3 days of focused work once the debris is cleared. He was quiet for a moment. I'd have to pull men off winter maintenance. I know. Pete won't like it. Pete doesn't like most things, Mara said, and then caught herself because that was more than she'd intended to say. But Cassidy surprised her. He made a sound that was unmistakably the briefest possible version of a laugh. No, he agreed, he doesn't. He stood up back to his usual posture and looked at the window. I'll think about it. It was the same phrase he'd used before, but this time it carried a different weight. This time, she thought, he meant it. Storm came faster than anyone predicted. They had 3 days of warning the sky, doing what Wyoming skies did in November, going the color of old pewter and staying that way, the wind picking up direction and holding it. Cassidy had pushed the men to bring in extra wood and check the livestock shelter. The animals were moved. The loose equipment was secured. The usual preparations done competently. What nobody had thought much about was food. That was Mara's problem. And she knew it was a problem, approximately 36 hours before the storm hit. When she did the calculation, 3 days minimum of confinement, possibly longer if it was bad, and the current pantry supplies calibrated for normal consumption, not storm consumption, which was a different thing. Men trapped inside by weather ate more than men working outside. It wasn't laziness, it was cold and boredom, and the particular restlessness of physical workers with nothing to do with their bodies. She'd seen it before. She went through everything in the pantry and the root cellar one more time, counting with more precision than she had the first time. Then she rearranged the meal planning in her head, working backward from what she had to what she needed to stretch it to cover. It was tight. It was possible, but it was tight. She pulled Cassidy aside the evening before the storm arrived. We need to talk about provisions. He heard something in her tone and gave her his attention immediately. What's the problem? She laid it out for him. What was in the pantry, what the projected consumption was, where the gaps fell. She was precise and she was brief, because Cassidy was a man who processed information better without decoration. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. You're sure about these numbers? Yes. So we have enough for 5 days, not 7. Comfortably. If the storm runs 7 days and we consume at our current rate, we'll be short on protein and on flour by the end of it. She paused. There are ways to extend it. It means adjusting how I cook things, substituting some ingredients for others, making the portions feel fuller than they are with less actual volume. It's doable. But I wanted you to know the real situation. He rubbed his jaw. The men aren't going to love hearing they're being rationed. They don't need to know they're being rationed, Mara said. That's partly what I do. He looked at her steadily. Then, do what you need to do. She nodded and went back to the kitchen. The storm hit that night. By morning, the world outside the windows had been reduced to a white wall, and a sound like the wind was taking the roof personally. The temperature dropped hard and kept dropping. The men came in from the early morning livestock check, looking like they'd been sandblasted, stomping their boots on the porch boards and dragging cold air in with them every time the door opened. Mara was already up. She'd been up since 4, which was her standard, but this morning she'd used the early hours to reorganize the pantry by priority and start a large pot of something she was calling stew. Was technically a stretch of the word, but smelled convincing. Jeb, the youngest, came in first and hovered near the stove with the specific longing of someone 19 years old who hadn't been warm in 2 hours. She handed him a cup of coffee without comment, and he took it with both hands and didn't say thank you, but his face said it for him. The rest filed in over the next 20 minutes. Pete was the last. He stomped more mud off his boots than was strictly necessary, and took his place at the table with the particular deliberateness of a man announcing that he was tolerating the situation. Breakfast was cornmeal mush with a little lard and dried apples stirred in, coffee, and a pan of Johnny cake she'd made the night before. Not lavish, but hot, and there was enough of it. "What's for supper?" Donovan asked, which was optimistic given that they hadn't finished breakfast. "Stew," Mara said. "Real stew? What other kind is there?" Ferris elbowed Donovan, and they shared a look of muted satisfaction. The simple pleasures of men who worked outside in Wyoming in November. By noon, the wind was bad enough that going out to the barn required 2 men working together. Cassidy organized the shifts for livestock care and posted them on the wall by the door. The men rotated out in pairs, came back frozen, stood by the stove until they thawed, and generally got in Mara's way without meaning to. She worked around them. This was a skill she'd developed moving through a space that was technically hers, but filled with other people's presence, maintaining her own line of work without making anyone feel like they were being managed. It required a specific kind of patience that wasn't the same as tolerance. Tolerance was just putting up with something. This was active staying aware of where everyone was, adjusting her movements without looking like she was adjusting, keeping the kitchen functional without making it feel like a kitchen. Old Roy sat in the corner for most of the afternoon and whittled something. She never figured out what it was. Caleb spent the storm day differently from the others. He wasn't restless the way Donovan and Ferris were, wasn't surly the way Pete was, wasn't adrift the way Jeb was. He read for a while. She caught the cover this time, a water-damaged copy of something she didn't recognize. Then he spent a couple of hours at the table with a piece of paper, writing something in a small, careful hand. Caught her glancing at it once and didn't make anything of it, just kept writing. She didn't ask. It wasn't her business. Supper was better than breakfast, which was the direction meals were supposed to go. The stew had genuine depth to it because she'd started the bone broth the evening before and let it reduce slowly bones she'd been saving for a week because she didn't throw anything away if she could help it. The men ate well and ate enough, and nobody went to their bunk hungry. And Mara sat at the kitchen's table after everyone else had gone and did the math for the next day's meals and found it was still workable. She allowed herself exactly 3 minutes of satisfaction about that. Then she banked the fire and went to bed. Day 2 of the storm was longer. The wind didn't ease up. The temperature outside was doing something that would have been academically interesting if anyone had been in a position to appreciate it academically, which they were not. The livestock check at midday required breaking ice from the troughs, which Cassidy reported took 40 minutes longer than it should have because the ice was deeper than expected. By mid-afternoon, the men were developing the particular cabin fever that set in when physical people are confined without enough work to do. Pete started an argument with Ferris about the right way to hang a saddle that had nothing whatsoever to do with hanging saddles. Donovan and Jeb played cards for a while, then stopped when Donovan won too many times. Roy kept whittling. Caleb retreated to the bunk room. She heard the door close and didn't hear it open again for 2 hours. Mara made bread. Real bread, not Johnny cake. She'd been rationing the flour carefully enough that she could afford this. And she too from experience that the smell of bread baking did something to people's moods that couldn't be replicated any other way. It was one of the older understandings in the world that warmth and bread smell were the same as safety in some ancient part of the brain. She wasn't wrong about the effect. By the time the loaves came out, the argument about saddles had dissolved. Pete took the first slice she offered him without comment, but he ate it standing up with his eyes closed for a moment, which told her everything she needed to know about how miserable he'd been. "That's decent," he said. It was the closest thing to a compliment she'd received from him since she arrived. "Thank you," she said, and meant it without irony. She was slicing the second loaf when she heard Cassidy come in from outside, earlier than his scheduled check, which meant something had happened. She could tell from the way he moved quicker than usual, but controlled, not panicked. "Problem," he said to the room. Everyone looked up. East bunk chimneys blocked. Sparks came back into the room, the caps frozen shut with ice and debris. He looked around. "Caleb, I need you, Pete. You too. The rest of you stay inside." Pete and Caleb followed him out before she could say anything. Jeb started toward the door. Cassidy pointed at him without looking. "You stay." Jeb stayed. Mara listened to the wind for a while and thought about 3 men on a roof in a Wyoming blizzard, clearing a frozen chimney cap. which was one of the more dangerous things she could think of doing in current conditions. And she put more wood in the stove and made sure there was hot coffee ready for when they came back. And she tried not to think about what she'd do if they didn't. They came back 40 minutes later, all three of them, cold enough that their faces were past red and heading towards something she didn't like the look of. She put coffee in their hands before they'd finished taking their coats off. Caleb's hands were shaking slightly when he took the cup, not from fear from cold. His fingers had been unprotected at some point during the work. She could tell from the color of them, and she refilled his cup without saying anything and made sure he stayed near the stove until the color came back to normal. He noticed. He didn't comment on it, but he noticed. It was the third day of the storm when Pete decided to have his confrontation. She'd known it was coming. Not that specific day, not that specific form, but she'd known from his first week that the accommodation he'd made to her presence was temporary. Men like Pete, not cruel, not stupid, but with a bone-deep investment in the way things had always worked, usually held it together until pressure got high enough. 3 days of confinement with a woman rearranging the kitchen and controlling the food supply was apparently that threshold. He came in mid-morning when the kitchen was empty, except for her. She was at the work table, doing the daily inventory update, and he stood in the doorway for a moment before coming in. "We need more food," he said. She didn't look up from her writing. "You're eating the same portions as everyone else. I'm twice the size of Jeb. The same portions aren't the same." He wasn't wrong about that, actually. "I've accounted for it. You're getting more than the others. You've been getting more since the storm started." That stopped him. He hadn't realized. "Still not enough." "I know," she said. "We're in a tight stretch. We have enough to get through the storm, but not with significant extras." She set down her pencil and looked at him directly. "I'm not doing this to make your life difficult. I'm doing it so everyone has enough on day 7, not just day 3. How do you know what we've got and what we need?" "Because I inventoried everything twice, and I've been tracking consumption every meal since I arrived." He stared at her. Then he crossed his arms. "What are you actually doing here? And don't say cook." She looked at him for a moment. He was asking a real question. She thought not a hostile one, despite the posture. She considered how to answer it. "I'm doing what's in front of me to do," she said. "Same as you're not a ranch hand." "No. But I'm not only a cook either," she paused. "I grew up on working land. I understand how operations like this run and how they fail. When I got here, this one was moving in a specific direction." She didn't say failing. She didn't need to. "I've been trying to slow that down. Counting beans." She held his gaze. "Also by figuring out why the water situation is more complicated than it looks, and what Gideon Voss actually wants, and what this ranch already has that nobody's been paying attention to." There was a silence that was longer than their previous silences. "Voss," Pete said. "He's not offering help. Cassidy thinks he might be. Cassidy is trying to keep this operation alive with limited resources and no clear legal backup," she said. "He's working with what he has. I'm trying to give him more to work with." Pete was looking at her differently now. Not warmly, that wasn't the direction Pete moved, but differently. Like something had shifted slightly in his assessment. "The channels," he said. "The ones you've been going on about." She hadn't been going on about them, she'd mentioned them twice. She let that go. "Yes. Cassidy told me. What do you think?" He was quiet for a moment. "I think it's a lot of work for something that might not pan out." "Pond exists," she said. "The channels exist. The spring registration exists. Those aren't maybe situations." He unfolded his arms. It was a small movement and probably unconscious, but she noticed it. "You've been out to the pond before the storm?" "Yes." "By yourself?" "Yes." He almost said something and then didn't. Whatever it was, it didn't come out as hostile. "Finally, what do you need to get those channels cleared?" she told him. Basic equipment. A period after the storm when the ground was workable. She laid it out the same way she'd laid it out to Cassidy without decoration. Just the actual picture. When she finished, Pete rubbed the back of his neck, which was the same gesture Cassidy used when processing information he hadn't wanted to receive. "I'll think about it," he said, and left the kitchen. It was not a yes, but it was not a no. And from Pete, at this stage of things, the absence of a no was something. On the 4th day, the storm began to ease. Not dramatically. Wyoming didn't do dramatic exits with its weather. It eased the way it always did. Incrementally, the wind dropping by degrees, the visibility extending from nothing to something to almost enough. By the afternoon, Cassidy pronounced the worst of it over and sent the men out to do a full property check. The damage was moderate. One outbuilding had lost part of its roof. A section of fence on the western perimeter had come down under drifted snow. The livestock was intact, which was what mattered most. And the kitchen, which Mara had kept running without interruption through the entire storm, had managed the impossible. 4 days, and nobody had gone hungry. Not once. It was Jeb who said it out loud, which was both unexpected and somehow fitting. He came in from the property check and stood at the kitchen door and said, "We didn't run short," with a slightly dazed expression, like he was reporting a fact he didn't fully believe. "No," Mara said. "Storms like this usually mean he stopped. Last winter, before you got here, we ran short on the 5th day, and Cassidy had to ride out in bad conditions to get more from the Henderson place." She hadn't known that. How bad was the ride? Jeb looked uncomfortable. Bad enough that he didn't talk about it much after. She filed that information away. Said nothing. The men came in for supper that evening in a different way than they'd come in for any previous meal. Not celebratory that would have required more energy than any of them had. But something was different in the room. The particular grim practicality of men who'd been braced for something unpleasant and found it hadn't arrived. Pete came in and sat down and looked at the food on the table, and then looked at Mara, who was at the stove. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. But it was Caleb's reaction she noticed most, because it was the least visible one. Came in with the others, took his seat at the end of the table, looked around the room, and then he looked at her, and there was something in his expression that she hadn't seen directed at her before. Not admiration exactly. Too specific for that, more like recognition. Like he'd seen something confirmed that he'd already suspected. She looked away before the moment could become something more than what it was. Cassidy called a meeting the morning after the storm cleared. All the men in the main room, which was cramped enough with 7 of them, that someone was always brushing someone else's elbow. Mara was in the kitchen, which meant she could hear everything without being officially present, which suited her. He told them about Voss and the water situation. Not just the easement offer, but what she'd explained to him, the spring registration, the channels, the pond, the long-term implication of accepting access terms that put Voss's people in the corridor of the spring. He laid it out clearly. She could tell he'd spent time organizing it, because the version he presented was more coherent than the version he'd first understood. There was a long silence when he finished. Then Pete said, "The cook told you this." Mara told me, "Yes, I checked the documents myself. She's right." Another pause. She walked out to the northwest corner alone before the storm. She did, to look at the pond. That's what she said. A third silence, longer than the others. "Well," Pete said, and his voice had changed, still gruff. Still Pete. But something underneath it that wasn't dismissal anymore. "Then somebody better clear those channels before Voss comes back." She heard from the kitchen the sound of several men making sounds that were not quite agreement, but were close enough to it. Cassidy said, "I'm thinking we start the eastern section next week, once the ground settles. 4 men, starting at the inlet end, working toward the pasture." "I'll do it," Pete said. It wasn't what anyone had expected him to say. "Me, Donovan, Ferris, and the kid." A pause. "If we're doing it, might as well do it right." In the kitchen, Mara exhaled slowly through her nose, turned back to the stove. She hadn't saved the ranch. She hadn't done anything dramatic. She'd counted supplies and read old documents, and walked out to a frozen pond alone before a blizzard, and then cooked for 4 days without letting anything run out. But the meeting was happening. The channels were going to be cleared, and the spring, that quiet, steady, registered source of water in the northwest corner of this property, was going to have its history documented so thoroughly that Gideon Voss couldn't touch it. Not yet a victory, not even close to one. But the direction had changed. That was enough for now. She started on the noon meal. 2 days later, Voss sent a man. Not Voss himself, one of his people, a compact, clean-shaven man named Aldrich, who arrived at the gate with the practiced politeness of someone whose job was to deliver messages that were difficult to refuse. He asked for Cassidy. Cassidy came out. Mara watched from the window. Couldn't hear the conversation, but she could read Cassidy's posture, the way he stood, arms at his side, face neutral, listening without agreement. Aldrich handed him something, another folded paper, and Cassidy took it without looking at it, which was a specific kind of control. Aldrich tipped his hat and left. Cassidy came inside. He set the paper on the kitchen table, which had become the de facto meeting place for anything important at the ranch. Mara looked at the paper without touching it. He revised the offer. Cassidy said. Reduce the easement width from 40 feet to 25. She thought about that. Does it still run alongside the spring access? Cassidy spread the paper open. It still runs the same corridor, just narrower. Narrower is still there, she said. I know. She studied the document. Voss had added language about cooperative water access in exchange for the easement vague enough to be meaningless legally, but specific enough to look generous on paper. Kind of language that implied partnership while establishing nothing of the sort. He's not going away, she said. No, she straightened up. Then the documentation has to be airtight before he comes back himself. Cassidy folded the paper. How much time do you think we have? I don't know, she said honestly. But I'd treat it like not much. He nodded slowly. Then the channel work starts Monday. I know. I'm going to need you to write something down for me. He said it awkwardly, like he wasn't sure how to phrase it. A description of the water system. What you found in the documents, what you saw at the pond, how the channels connect. In plain language that I could take to a land office if I needed to. She looked at him. You want me to put together a formal description? In plain language, he said again. I don't write like a lawyer, but if I had something written down clearly, I could have someone look at it. He paused. There's a man in Casper who handles land records. Not a full lawyer, but he knows the territory filings. If I send him something specific, he might be able to help us understand where we stand. Mara thought for a moment. I can do that. How long? 2 days. Cassidy picked up the folded paper from Voss and tapped it once against his palm. 2 days, he said, and put it in his coat pocket. That evening, after supper, she sat at the kitchen table with the water diagrams and the registration documents and 3 fresh sheets of paper, and she wrote the clearest, most complete account she could manage of Black Hollow Ranch's water rights, history, and current state. She wrote for 3 hours. She organized it by section, with the spring registration first, then the channel system, then the pond, then the eastern irrigation network, then a precise description of what Voss's easement proposals would affect. She was not a lawyer. She knew that. The document she produced was not a legal brief, but it was accurate, and it was complete, and it laid out the picture so clearly that anyone who read it would immediately understand what Black Hollow Ranch owned and what Gideon Voss was trying to get close to. She read it through twice after she finished, corrected 3 places where she'd been imprecise, and then set it aside to dry. Candle had burned down to a stub. Outside, the post-storm silence of the plains was absolute, that specific quiet that followed bad weather, when the land seemed to be catching its breath. Caleb's boots on the kitchen floor. She looked up. He was standing in the doorway in his work clothes, hat in hand, which meant he'd been outside recently, despite the late hour. He looked at the papers on the table. You're still up, he said, clearly. He came inside and looked at the pages without touching them. After a moment, that's a serious piece of writing for a ranch cook. I write when I need to write something down, she said. He was quiet for a moment. My name's on those old filings, he said. The recent ones, at least. Cassidy files everything under the property account. He paused, and so it was something in the pause that she felt, but couldn't quite identify something careful about it. Like a man watching where he put his foot. I want you to know I think what you're doing matters. She looked at him. He met her gaze without flinching. Without any of the performance that usually came with men who needed you to know they thought you were capable. Why are you telling me that? She asked. He thought about it. Because I don't think anyone else has said it. She didn't know what to say to that, which was uncommon for her. So she said nothing, and he said goodnight, and she sat alone at the kitchen table for a while longer, listening to the silence outside, thinking about the document she'd written, and the pond she'd found, and the man who'd just told her, without decoration, that her work meant something. She folded the document carefully and set it with the diagrams in her trunk. Tomorrow there would be more to do. There always was. But tonight, for a few minutes, she let herself sit in the kitchen of a broken ranch at the edge of winter and feel something that was not quite peace and not quite hope, but was closer to both than she'd been in a long time. The document she'd written reached the man in Casper on a Thursday. Cassidy had sent it with the supply rider folded inside a plain envelope, with a cover letter he'd written himself, 3 lines, asking for an assessment of the water rights situation and what legal standing the ranch had if a neighbor attempted to establish access through the spring corridor. He hadn't told the men he'd sent it. He hadn't told Mara either, but she'd seen the envelope on the table the morning the rider left and understood what it was. She didn't ask him about it. It was his decision to make. She'd given him the information, What he did with it belonged to him. In the meantime, the channel work had started. Pete drove it the way Pete drove everything, without ceremony and without complaint, with a flat expectation that the work would be done, because work was what you did. He and Donovan and Ferris and Jeb started at the inlet end of the Eastern Channel on a Monday morning, when the ground was still hard enough to make the digging difficult, but soft enough on the surface to be workable. Mara watched them head out from the kitchen window and thought about the diagram she'd first traced with her finger, and the reality of those same lines now being worked by 4 men in the cold. The work was exactly as hard as she'd said it would be. The debris in the channel was years-deep compacted grass, silted earth, sections of collapsed bank, in one place an entire dead tree that had fallen across the cut and been slowly buried. Pete's response to the tree was to look at it for approximately 3 seconds and then go get an axe. She brought them a midday meal out to the field every day that week, not because it was required, not because anyone asked her to, but because she'd done the math on how much energy 4 men doing that kind of work needed, and the math said the noon meal mattered. Carried it in a basket with a wrapped pot of coffee and a cloth to keep it from freezing, and she left it at the edge of the work site without interrupting the rhythm of what they were doing. By the end of the 3rd day, Pete said something to her that he directed at the middle distance rather than at her face, which was as close as he got to direct address in moments that required any kind of acknowledgement. "Noon meal helps," he said. "Good," she said. "Ferris's back isn't right. If you had something that helped with that." She thought about it. "Willow bark tea. I'll have it ready in the mornings." He nodded at the middle distance and went back to work. Caleb wasn't on the channel crew. Cassidy had him doing fence repair on the western perimeter, which was the section that had come down in the storm. She saw him briefly in the mornings, when the men gathered for breakfast before heading out, and in the evenings at supper. The pattern of his attention, that particular stillness she'd noticed from the first week, continued, but there was a quality to it now that was harder to dismiss as simple awareness. He was watching her think, she realized. Not in a strange way, just in the way of someone who found the process genuinely interesting. She wasn't sure what to do with that, so she mostly ignored it. On the 8th day of channel work, Gideon Voss came back. Not Aldrich this time. Voss himself on a good horse, with 2 men behind him who were not carrying surveying equipment. They were carrying something else, not weapons, but the particular posture of men whose presence was meant to be felt. Muscle quietly displayed. Mara was at the front of the property, checking the kitchen garden's frost cover when she heard the gate. She straightened up and looked, and for a moment she and Voss were facing each other across 40 feet of frozen yard before Cassidy came out of the barn. Voss looked at her for exactly 1 second. Then he looked away, the kind of look that categorized and dismissed in a single motion. Felt it land the way she always felt that particular look land, like a hand pushing her half a step back. And then she felt the familiar thing that followed it, the settling, the going still, the refusal to be moved by someone else's assessment. She stayed where she was and kept her face neutral. Cassidy crossed the yard and shook Voss's hand. Professional enough, but not warm. Mara listened. Walt. Voss's voice was the same as she remembered, controlled, pleasant, with the specific texture of a man who'd had enough successful conversations to assume each new one would go his way. "I heard you've had men working on the eastern section this week." "Maintenance work," Cassidy said. "On the old irrigation channels." Pause. "Property upkeep." Long Voss smiled. Not the land-assessing smile from the first visit, something smaller, more focused. "I also heard you sent something to Casper." "To Halverson." Cassidy's expression didn't change, but she saw something sharpen in his eyes. Halverson was apparently the land records man. Someone had talked, or Voss had the kind of reach that meant he found out about most things that happened in the county before long. "I'm trying to get a clear picture of the property's situation," Cassidy said. "That's sensible." Voss shifted in the saddle. "I'm going to be straightforward with you, Walt, because I think you deserve that. My offer on the table is genuinely fair. The terms I've proposed would give your operation reliable water access through my northern channel, and all I'm asking in return is a reasonable easement corridor. But my patience on the offer isn't unlimited. I have other options for that northern access, and if Black Hollow doesn't want to work with me, I'll make other arrangements." "What kind of other arrangements?" Cassidy asked. Voss paused. "The kind that might make the water situation here more complicated, not less." He said it without heat, which was worse than if he'd said it with anger. It was a statement of fact from a man who had the resources to make it a fact. "I'm not threatening you, Walt. I'm being honest about the landscape. I appreciate that, Cassidy said in a tone that appreciated nothing. Voss's eyes moved across the yard again, brief, scanning. They landed on Mara for a second time, and this time he held it a moment longer. Your cook's out early. She's checking the garden. He looked at her with the mild curiosity of a man trying to understand something irrelevant. Then he looked back at Cassidy. Think about what I said. I'll give you another week. He turned his horse, and his 2 men followed him out the gate, without either of them having said a word. Cassidy stood in the yard for a moment after they'd gone. Then he turned around and walked toward the barn, without looking at Mara. She went back to checking the frost cover, but her mind was not on the garden. My patience on the offer isn't unlimited. That was the part. And underneath it, the kind that might make the water situation here more complicated. She turned both sentences over carefully, the way she turned problems over when she needed to understand their shape before she could address them. He hadn't specified how he'd make things more complicated. He didn't need to. The threat was the vagueness of it, the implication that he had tools she didn't know about, which meant she needed to figure out what those tools were before he used them. She finished with the garden and went inside and sat at the kitchen table with the water diagrams again. The answer came from an unexpected direction. Old Roy, who almost never spoke, and had been whittling the same piece of wood for 3 weeks, without it becoming anything recognizable, came into the kitchen on a Tuesday evening after supper when everyone else had gone to their bunks. He stood in the doorway until she noticed him, which took a moment because she'd been deep in her notes. She looked up. Roy. He came inside and sat down at the table across from her, moving carefully the way he always did. He looked at the diagrams. I know where the markers are, he said. She put down her pencil. What markers? The boundary markers on the northwest corner. The ones that show where our property ends and the Voss property starts. He was looking at the diagrams, not at her. I've been on this ranch 22 years. I know where every marker is. Why are you telling me this now? He was quiet for a moment. Roy was a man who chose words the way a person chose footing on rough ground carefully, one at a time, never trusting the surface until he tested it. Because 2 days ago, when I was out checking the fence line after the storm, I found one of them wrong. She went still. Wrong how? The northwest corner post. It marks the boundary of the spring access area. He put one thick finger on the diagram, on the exact corner she'd been concerned about. Been moved. 6 feet south. Maybe 7. The kitchen was quiet. Outside, the wind was doing its usual thing against the eaves. Are you certain it was moved? She said. Not settled. I set that post myself in 1878, Roy said. I know where it sits in the ground. It's been moved south, and the ground around the base isn't weathered the same as it should be. He looked up at her for the first time. His eyes were steady and certain. Someone dug it out and moved it. She sat with that for a moment. A moved boundary marker, even by 6 feet, shifted the legal boundary of the spring access corridor. If that marker was accepted as the property boundary, the spring itself, or the documented access to it, would fall into contested ground. And if it was contested ground, Voss's easement proposal suddenly looked like a solution to a problem he had created. It was elegant in a way that made her stomach drop. When did you check that corner last? She said. Before the storm. Roy thought October, before the first freeze. So it was moved sometime in the past 6 weeks. During the storm, most likely, when nobody was out that direction. That's what I'd say. She looked at the diagram. Did you tell Cassidy? I'm telling you. She looked at him. Why? Roy considered the question with the same deliberate care he applied to everything. Because you're the one who's been thinking about this, he said. And I'm too old to be slow about recognizing who in a room understands what's happening. She sat back in her chair. The candle between them threw uneven light across the diagram. Roy, I need you to take me there tomorrow. I figured, he said, and got up and went to his bunk. They left before light. She told no one else, partly because she didn't want to create alarm before she'd confirmed what Roy had described, and partly because she'd learned that fewer people knowing something was generally safer until you understood what the something meant. Packed her notebook, her pencil, and the hand compass she'd bought at a hardware store 3 towns back, for reasons she couldn't have explained at the time, but was now grateful for. Roy moved slowly, but he moved surely, and he didn't waste energy on unnecessary conversation during the walk, which she appreciated. The northwest corner was a 40-minute walk from the main buildings, past the standing rocks, and through a section of scrub that was still carrying snow from the storm. He stopped at a spot that looked like every other spot in the terrain until she understood what she was looking at. Fence post, thick and old, set in the ground at a spot where the natural rock formation should have anchored it against movement. Crouched down and looked at the base. Roy was right. The ground at the south and west sides of the post was packed and weathered, the way soil was after years of compression. The ground at the north side, the side that's faced away from the Voss property, had a different texture. Disturbed. Settled back but not fully, the frost having locked it in a position slightly different from what long compression produced. She put her hand on it. The post was solid. Whoever had reset it had done a careful job, but not careful enough. She opened her notebook and began writing. The exact position, as close as she could determine it without professional equipment. Condition of the soil on each side. The distance from the standing rocks, which were unmovable, and therefore served as reference points. She paced out distances and wrote them down. She noted the compass bearing from the rocks to the post, and from the post toward the spring, and drew a rough map showing all of it. It took almost an hour. Roy stood nearby without impatience, occasionally pointing out a reference point she'd missed, never rushing her. When she was done, she stood up and looked in the direction of the spring, which she couldn't see from here, but knew was approximately 300 yards northwest. This marker is accepted as it stands, she said. What does it do to the boundary? Roy thought about it. Puts the spring access corridor on the edge, close enough that a decent lawyer could argue both ways. And Voss has a decent lawyer. Voss has 3 decent lawyers, Roy said without emphasis. She looked at the post one more time, and then at her notebook. We need a witness, she said. Someone other than me. Official or close to it. There's a county land assessor. Comes through twice a year. Roy paused. And there's Halverson in Casper. Cassidy already contacted Halverson. Then, Halverson needs to know about this before Voss decides the marker's been in its new position long enough to call it established. She looked at him. How long does it take to establish a marker? Legally? Roy rubbed his jaw. Depends on whether anyone challenges it. If nobody challenges it in the first season, it gets harder. He paused. I don't know the exact rule. She didn't either. But she understood the principle. Unchallenged positions became facts. That was how it worked in law, and in life not through grand gestures, but through the patient accumulation of things nobody bothered to dispute. Voss was betting on patience, on the ranch being too busy or too uncertain to challenge a 6-foot shift in a fence post on the northwest corner before it became reality. Closed her notebook. We need to get back. Told Cassidy that afternoon. All of it Roy's observation. The walk, what she'd documented, what she thought it meant. She laid it on the kitchen table the way she laid every problem on the kitchen table. In order, without drama, with the actual evidence in front of him, so he could see it himself. He was very quiet while she talked. When she finished, he sat with it for a moment, and she watched him process the full implication. She could see the moment it landed not in a dramatic way, but in the way that real understanding settled into a person's face when something stopped being a possibility and became a fact. He moved the marker, Cassidy said. Someone did. During the storm, most likely, when no one was working that corner. He stopped. It's deliberate, she said. The easement proposal, the water offer, the second visit, and now the marker. These aren't separate things. They're a sequence. He looked at his hands on the table. What do we do? Document everything we have and get it to Halverson as fast as possible. Roy's testimony about where the marker was set originally. My measurements from this morning, the water rights filing. All of it together, dated today, sent immediately. Can have the writer go tomorrow. Tonight, Mara said. He looked at her. If Voss finds out that Roy noticed the marker, and if he has the kind of reach that told him you'd contacted Halverson, he might move faster than we're expecting. Cassidy was quiet for a moment. Then he stood up. Caleb can ride tonight. He knows the Casper Road, and he's the best night rider I have. He paused. I'll ask him. He went to find Caleb. Mara sat at the table and pulled out fresh paper and began writing Roy's account as a formal statement, in clear language, with the date and the specific details of what he'd observed and when. She wrote her own account separately, the measurements, the compass bearings, the soil condition. She attached them both to the summary document she'd already produced about the water rights. When Caleb came into the kitchen 20 minutes later, he looked at the papers on the table and then at her. Cassidy told me, he said. Can you ride tonight? No hesitation. He came closer and looked at the papers. You wrote all this tonight? Roy's statement and my observation notes. They need to go with the existing document to Halverson. Together they make a complete picture. He picked up the pages and read through them. She watched him read, not checking whether he was reading correctly, but watching the way his face moved while he processed what was on the page. Calm, focused, a slight furrow between his brows at the part about the soil condition. "This is good," he said. He set the pages down. He looked at her. "How long have you been doing this kind of thing?" "What kind of thing?" "Seeing problems in their full shape before anyone else does." She considered the question. "Since I was young enough to realize that seeing problems didn't do any good unless you also figured out what to do about them." He was quiet for a moment. "Then I'm going to need the pages in an oilskin wrap. Temperature drops tonight. Paper won't survive loose in a saddlebag." "There's one in the equipment shed," she said. He nodded and gathered the papers. She noticed he was careful with them, not reverent, but careful, the way you handled something whose value you understood. He left half an hour later, in the dark, on a horse she could hear but not see from the kitchen window. The longest 3 days of the subsequent weeks were the ones waiting to hear back from Halverson. The channel work continued. The eastern section was more than half cleared now, and the first test of water flow from the spring connections was scheduled for the following week. Pete ran the crew without drama, which was his version of enthusiasm. The work was slow and cold and unglamorous, and Mara watched it advance from the periphery, with the particular investment of someone who had created the idea without being able to do the physical work herself. On the second day of waiting, Voss sent Aldrich again. Aldrich arrived mid-morning and asked for Cassidy with his usual professional courtesy, and Cassidy came out and listened to whatever Aldrich said, with his arms crossed and his face neutral. Conversation lasted less than 10 minutes. Aldrich left. Cassidy came into the kitchen and sat down. He looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. "He's withdrawing the easement offer," Cassidy said. She looked up. "That's and replacing it with a formal claim of adverse use on the Northwest Corridor." He said it flatly. "His lawyer has filed something with the county land office." Aldrich had a copy of the filing number. She sat with that. Adverse use was the legal mechanism Voss needed. If he could establish that his property had historically used the Northwest Corridor, he could claim a right to it regardless of the water rights filing. Different attack from the same direction. "When did he file?" she asked. "The filing number suggests last week, before Caleb rode to Casper," which meant Halverson was receiving their documentation at the same time as the adverse use filing, which meant the county land office now had two competing claims on the same corridor, and whoever made the stronger case or moved faster would determine what happened next. "Can Halverson stop it?" she asked. "He's not a judge," Cassidy said. "He can't stop anything, but he can advise us on how to challenge the filing and what evidence we'd need." He paused. "If we can show continuous established use of the spring and the channels by Black Hollow Ranch, and if Roy's testimony about the marker holds, Halverson thinks we have a case to challenge the adverse use claim." "Roy's testimony will hold," she said. "He set that post himself." "I know," Cassidy rubbed his face. "We need the channel work done. If the irrigation system is functional and documented as operational, it strengthens the argument that we've been continuously using the water source. Pete's crew is more than halfway through the eastern section. I know that too." He stood up. "I'm going to push them to finish by end of week instead of end of 2 weeks. I'll put more men on it." He paused in the doorway. "I need you to keep writing things down. Everything. Every day the crew works the channels. Dates, progress, anything that shows consistent ongoing use." He looked at her steadily. "You're the best I have at putting things clearly on paper." She almost said something deflecting. She stopped herself. "I'll document everything," she said. Confrontation she hadn't anticipated came on a Friday evening. Voss himself, at the gate at dusk, without Aldrich and without the 2 men who'd accompanied him before. Just Voss, on his horse, in the fading light. Cassidy was out at the channel site checking the day's progress. Most of the men were still out there. Mara was in the kitchen. Jeb came running to the kitchen door. "Ma'am, there's a man at the gate asking for whoever's in charge." She looked through the window. Voss sat his horse with the patience of someone who was not in a hurry because he believed the situation would resolve in his favor. "Go get Cassidy," she said to Jeb. "He's a 20-minute walk." "I know." Go Jeb went. She stood at the kitchen window and looked at Voss and thought about what he would do if Cassidy wasn't here, about the filing he'd made, about the marker 6 feet south of where Roy had set it. Then she took off her apron, hung it on the hook, and walked out to the gate. Voss looked down at her from his horse with the mild surprise of a man whose situation has produced an unexpected variable. "I'm looking for Cassidy," he said. "He's in the field. He'll be back shortly." She held the gate post with one hand and looked up at him. "Is there something I can help you with in the meantime?" He looked at her for a moment. "You're the cook." "Yes." He seemed to weigh something. "I've heard about you," he said. "That you've been involved in how Cassidy's been handling the water situation. I've helped where I could." Voss leaned forward slightly on his saddle. "I'm going to be direct. The filing I've made with the county is legitimate. My family's operation has used that northwest corridor for access since before the current Black Hollow ownership. The adverse use claim will hold because it's accurate. It will hold if it goes unchallenged," she said. "You know, that's not the same thing." He looked at her with more interest than he'd shown before. "The challenge would have to show established continuous use by this operation. Channel work that started 2 weeks ago isn't continuous use. A dry pond doesn't demonstrate active water management. A water rights filing from 1874 does," she said. "Filings don't win cases by themselves." "No," she agreed, "but they establish the baseline. And the testimony of a man who set that boundary post himself 22 years ago, and who can describe in exact detail where it sat in relation to the standing rocks, complicates a marker that was moved 6 feet south sometime in the past 6 weeks." She held his gaze. "Don't you think?" The silence that followed was the longest one she'd shared with Gideon Voss. He sat on his horse and she stood at the gatepost, and the light was going fast, and neither of them looked away. "The marker wasn't moved," he said. His voice was steady. "I know," she said. "That's what your lawyer would say." He studied her. She had the sense that he was genuinely reassessing something, not backing down, not capitulating, but taking measure of what he was dealing with in a way he hadn't needed to do before. "You're not what I expected," he said, and there was something in it that was not a compliment and not an insult, just an observation from a man recalibrating. "I know," she said again. "Who's behind her?" "Cassidy, coming fast across the yard, with Pete and 2 others behind him." She stepped back from the gate and let Cassidy take the position that was his. Conversation between Cassidy and Voss was short and pointed. Cassidy told him the adverse use claim would be challenged, and that they had documentation to support the challenge. Voss told him the filing was legitimate, and he'd see them at the county hearing. Then he turned his horse and rode out. When the sound of hooves had faded, Cassidy turned around. He looked at Mara. Pete stood behind him with an expression she hadn't seen on Pete's face before, something between reluctant acknowledgement and something that might, in a different light, have been respect. "You talked to him," Cassidy said. "I kept him occupied until you got here," she said. "What did you say?" "What needed to be said?" Pete made a sound. Couldn't tell if it was approval or something else. He turned and walked back toward the channel site without saying anything more. But the way he walked was different from the way he'd been walking for the past 4 weeks. And she noticed it. County hearing was set for 3 weeks out. Halverson's response arrived 2 days after Voss's visit, carried back by Caleb, who'd ridden to Caspert again the second time in 10 days to meet with the man directly, rather than waiting for letters. Caleb came back looking tired and cold and satisfied in a contained way, and he put the envelope on the kitchen table and poured himself coffee before she could offer it. "Halverson says the documentation is strong," he said. "The 1874 filing has priority. Roy's testimony about the marker placement is exactly the kind of evidence that challenges an adverse use claim. And the channel work," he paused, looking at the notes she'd been keeping daily of the crew's progress. "The fact that we started it before the adverse use filing was made means it can't be characterized as reactive. We were working the water system before he made his claim." She exhaled slowly. "The timing matters. It matters a lot. If we'd started the channels after his filing, a lawyer could argue we were manufacturing continuous use after the fact." Caleb looked at her. "We started before." "By 8 days," she said. 8 days is enough." She sat down. The full weight of that timing settled on her. The storm, the conversations with Cassidy, Pete's agreement in the kitchen on day 3 of the blizzard, the channel work beginning the Monday after. None of it had been planned as legal strategy. It had been planned as the right thing to do for a ranch that was falling apart. And it had happened to put them 8 days ahead of a legal attack they hadn't known was coming. Halverson also said. Caleb set down his cup, and his voice changed slightly. Not in a dramatic way, but she noticed. He said whoever wrote the water rights summary should probably be at the county hearing. that the document is precise enough that it would help to have the person who compiled it able to speak to it if needed. She looked at him. He wants me at the hearing. He didn't know it was you, Caleb said. He asked who had compiled the documentation, I told him. He paused. He said, whoever you are, you saved us a considerable amount of work he'd otherwise have had to do himself. She didn't know what to do with that. She picked up her pencil and looked at her notes. Will you come? Caleb asked. She looked at the notes, at the dates, at the sequence she'd been documenting every day since Cassidy asked her to, the channel work, the progress, the dates, the names of the men who'd worked each section, the small, precise, unglamorous record of a ranch defending itself through the only means available to it. Yes, she said. She said it simply because it was simple. There wasn't a version of this story where she'd built all of it and then stayed home. Caleb nodded. He finished his coffee. He put the cup in the basin and started toward the door, and then he stopped. Mara, she looked up. He was looking at her with that particular steadiness of his, and there was something in it that was different from all the previous times, more direct, more careful, like a man who had been thinking about something for a long time and had finally decided to step toward it. I need to tell you something, he said. Before the hearing, before all of it gets further along, he paused. It's about the ranch. She set down her pencil. Outside, the wind moved against the eaves. The fire in the stove ticked and settled. She looked at Caleb Rourke, standing in her kitchen doorway with his hat in his hand, and she felt something in the air between them shift, not dramatically, not in a way she could have described easily, but shift. All right, she said. He opened his mouth, and then Pete's voice came from outside the door, calling for Caleb about something with the horses, and the moment broke apart. Caleb looked at the door, then back at her. Later, he said, put his hat on and went out. She sat at the table for a long moment, looking at the door he'd left through, and then at her notes, and then at nothing in particular. I need to tell you something about the ranch. She picked up her pencil and wrote the date at the top of a fresh page and started documenting the day's channel progress, because that was what needed to be done, and she was the person who did what needed to be done. Whatever Caleb had been about to say stayed at the edge of her thinking for the rest of the evening, quiet and unresolved, like the pond she'd found waiting in the northwest corner to be filled again. He never got the chance to finish what he'd started saying that evening. The next morning came, with its own demands, a problem with one of the mares, a section of the cleared channel that had partially collapsed overnight, where the bank was weaker than Pete had estimated, and a message from Halverson asking for 2 additional pieces of documentation before the hearing. The ranch absorbed everything the way ranches did, without pause, without acknowledgement of the fact that there were people inside it, trying to manage things that went beyond the daily work. Mara noticed Caleb moving through his day with the same contained quality he always had, but she noticed also that he looked at her once or twice across the yard or at the supper table with something unfinished in his expression. She didn't push it. Whatever he'd been about to say would come when it came, and in the meantime there was too much else requiring attention. The county hearing was in 12 days. She spent those 12 days the way she'd spent most of her time at Black Hollow Ranch, doing several things simultaneously while appearing to do only one. Cooked, and she kept the kitchen running, and she put noon meals out to the channel crew, and she also finished the supplementary documentation Halverson had requested, organized Roy's written testimony into a form that would be easy to present, and went back out to the northwest corner twice more, with her notebook to verify her measurements and add observations she'd missed the first time. On the second of those visits, she found something she wished she hadn't. It was Jeb who came with her, because Cassidy had decided she shouldn't go out to the far corners of the property alone anymore, not with the hearing approaching and Voss's behavior becoming less predictable. He'd put it to her gently, which was not his usual mode, and she'd understood what he was actually saying, that they couldn't afford any complication in the 2 weeks before the hearing, and a woman alone on the northwest boundary during a contested land dispute was a kind of complication she might not be able to manage on her own. She hadn't argued. She'd asked for Jeb, because Jeb was young enough not to have opinions about what she should be looking at, and attentive enough to be actually useful. They reached the northwest corner on a clear, cold morning, the sky the hard blue of Wyoming in late winter, and she went immediately to the boundary post that Roy had identified. She stood over it and looked at it, and then looked at the ground around it again. The post had been moved a second time, not back to its original position. Further south. Another 3 or 4 feet, She estimated it was hard to be certain without the reference measurements she'd taken before. But she was certain it had moved, because she'd noted the exact distance from the standing rocks at her last visit, and the distance now was different. Stood very still for a moment. Jeb came up beside her. "What's wrong?" "Look at the base of this post," she said quietly. "Tell me what you see." He crouched down, 19 years old in earnest, looking at the ground with genuine attention. He'd been paying more attention to things in general lately. She'd noticed it over the past few weeks. The way proximity to someone who looked carefully at the world sometimes encouraged the same habit in others. "Ground's been worked," he said. "The frost pattern's different on this side." "Yes." He stood up. "Someone moved it. Recently," she said. "Within the last few days." She opened her notebook and took out her compass and began remeasuring immediately. Hands steady, because she made them steady, writing down every number twice to make sure she had it right. "Jeb, I need you to remember this day. The date, the time, what you see right now. Can you do that?" "Yes, ma'am." "I need you to be able to say it clearly if someone asks you about it later. In front of people you don't know, in a formal setting. Can you still do that?" He was quiet for a second. "Then yes, ma'am. I can." She finished her measurements and closed the notebook and looked at the post one more time. Someone had been here between her last visit and this morning. Someone had decided that moving the marker once wasn't enough, that a few more feet of southward shift would be better, or that Voss's legal team needed a wider margin to work with. She thought about what Voss had said to her at the gate. The marker wasn't moved. Said steadily, without flinching, with the calm of a man who believed his version of events would be the one that mattered. Thought, not if mine is better documented. She walked back to the ranch and went directly to Cassidy. When she laid it out for him, the second movement, the new measurements, Jeb's witness account, Cassidy sat at the kitchen table, with the particular expression of a man watching a situation become more serious than he'd wanted it to be. He didn't say anything for a moment after she finished. "Then he's moving it again, someone is. It has to be his men. Nobody else has reason." He pressed both hands flat on the table. "This is getting worse. It was always going to get worse before it got better," she said. "He needs the marker further south by the hearing. If the county assessor measures from the current position, it changes the entire picture of where the spring access falls. Can we move it back?" She looked at him. "If we move it, we're doing exactly what we're accusing him of doing. We can't touch it." He understood. She could see it settle on him, the unfairness of it, which was real and also beside the point. The law didn't care about fairness in the abstract. It cared about documentation, precedent, and the better prepared argument. "We have the measurements from Roy's original testimony," she said. "We have my first set of measurements. Now we have a second set showing further movement. Jeb is a witness to today's finding." She paused. "This doesn't hurt our case, Cassidy. It helps it. A marker that's been moved twice in 6 weeks isn't a settled boundary, it's evidence." He looked at her steadily. "I need to contact Halverson today. Write it tonight, I'll help you draft it. Send the writer at first light." He nodded. He looked at his hands. He looked up. "Mara, I need to say something to you." She waited. "When you arrived here, I thought you'd last 2 weeks. I thought you were another person who'd seen the advertisement and needed somewhere to be for a little while." He wasn't looking at her with the usual evaluating quality. He was looking at her directly, which was rarer. "I've been running this operation for 11 years, and I have never had someone walk onto this property and understand it the way you did. Not in 11 years. She didn't know what to say to that, so she said the most accurate thing available to her. I needed somewhere to be. That part wasn't wrong." He made a sound that was as close as Cassidy ever came to a laugh. Then he got up and went to find paper for the letter to Halverson. The letter went out at first light. 2 days later, Caleb found her at the kitchen table before breakfast, before anyone else was up, in the gray early light she'd come to think of as the most honest part of the day. He came in without a sound, and she heard him only when he pulled out the chair across from her. She looked up. He was dressed for work, which meant he'd already been outside. His face had the slight tension of someone who'd made a decision during the night and was going to stay with it. "I need to tell you what I started to say," he said, "before the hearing. You need to know it before, not after." She set down her pencil. She waited. He looked at the table for a moment. "Then at her, I own the ranch." The kitchen was very quiet. "Cassidy manages operations," he said. "He always has. He's good at it, and I trust him. But Black Hollow Ranch, the deed, the water rights, the property registration, it's mine. Has been for 6 years." She sat with that for a moment. She let it settle slowly the way water settled into new ground. You're not a ranch hand. No. You've been working alongside the men, taking orders from Cassidy. He gives good orders. A pause. And I wanted to know what the ranch looked like from inside it, not from the owner's position, from the ground. He looked at her steadily. I've done it for years. Come and go. Work a season. Listen to what the men say when they don't think the owner is present. She was quiet for a moment. She noticed that her hands had gone very still on the table. Why are you telling me now? She said. Because you're going to the county hearing. You're going to stand in front of an assessor and speak to documentation that pertains to my property. You deserve to know whose property you've been defending. He paused. And because I should have told you earlier. I kept waiting for the right moment, and there wasn't one, and then things moved fast. He stopped. I should have told you earlier. She looked at him. He met her gaze the way he always did, without deflection, without performance. What does Cassidy know? She asked. Everything. Always has. Pete? No, the others know. She thought about the past weeks. About every conversation she'd had with Cassidy that had carried a slightly different quality from his conversations with the men, not deference. Exactly. But a different kind of consideration. She thought about Caleb bringing her the water diagrams, about the careful way he'd read her documentation before writing to Casper, about the night in the kitchen when he'd said, I want you to know I think what you're doing matters, and the weight of that statement, which she now understood, was the weight of an owner acknowledging work done on his behalf without being able to say so. Felt betrayed. She knew she felt it, and she didn't try to talk herself out of it because it was accurate. Not betrayed in a dramatic way, not in the way of someone whose love had been deceived, but betrayed in the way of someone who had given their full effort and their full honesty to a situation, and who had not been given the full honesty of the situation in return. I trusted the person working beside me, she said. Not the name on the deed. I know. His voice was level but not indifferent. I'm not asking you to forgive the withholding. I'm asking you to understand why it happened. Those are different requests. Yes. They are. She looked at the table, at her notes, at the neat documentation she'd been building for weeks, with dates and measurements and careful language. All of it for a ranch whose owner had been standing in her kitchen every evening and hadn't told her. You could have told me, she said, early on, before any of this. Could have. I would have worked just as hard. He was quiet for a moment. I know that too now. A pause. I wasn't certain of it then. That was honest enough that it got through the anger. She sat with it. The men, she said. You'll tell them? The hearing. Once the legal situation is settled. She nodded slowly. Looked at the window. The light was coming up. Were you ever going to tell me? She asked. If the hearing hadn't forced it? He was quiet for long enough that she turned to look at him. His expression was the most unguarded she'd seen it, not raw, not exposed, but present in a way that didn't leave room for anything but honesty. Yes, he said. I was going to tell you. She believed him. She wasn't sure whether that made it better or more complicated, and she thought probably more complicated was the accurate answer. The hearing is in 8 days, she said finally. We do what needs doing. Talk about the rest after. He nodded. He rose from the table. He got to the doorway and stopped, and she thought he might say something more, but he just put his hat on and went outside, and the kitchen was quiet again, with the sound of the fire and the early morning and her own breathing. She picked up her pencil. She stared at the page for a moment without writing anything. Then she wrote the date and kept working, because that was what she did. The hearing was held in the county courthouse in a town called Millhaven, 2 hours by wagon from Black Hollow Ranch. Cassidy drove. Mara sat beside him. Caleb rode alongside on horseback, which she understood now was a practical decision. If the hearing ran long, someone needed to be able to ride fast in either direction. Roy had written his full testimony in a statement that Halverson had helped formalize. The old man's handwriting was slow but clear, and the statement was unambiguous about what he had said and where and when. The hearing room was smaller than she'd expected. A single room with a long table, an assessor named Greer, who had the harried look of a man managing too many disputes at once, Halverson at one side with a stack of documents, and Voss's lawyer, a thin man named Collier, whose suit was better than anything else in the room at the other. Voss himself was there. He sat behind Collier and looked at Mara when she came in with the same recalibrating expression he'd had at the gate. She held his gaze for exactly the time it took to walk to her seat, and then she looked at the documents in her hands. The hearing was not dramatic, which was what she'd expected. Legal proceedings rarely were when you were the one who'd done the preparation. They were simply the moment when preparation met its counterpart, and one or the other turned out to have been more thorough. Collier presented the adverse use claim first. He was precise and fluent, and he used language designed to make the claim sound long established and reasonable. He cited Voss family use of the Northwest Corridor going back nearly 2 decades. He presented 2 affidavits from Voss ranch hands attesting to regular access through the area. He made the current boundary marker position sound like the natural and original placement. Halverson presented the Black Hollow response. He entered the 1,874 water rights filing. He entered Roy's formal statement, which he read aloud in sections, the old man's plain language sitting oddly dignified in the formal room. He entered Mara's documentation, the water system's summary, the channel work record, the measurement notes from both Northwest Corner visits, with dates. Then Greer asked for the person who had compiled the documentation to speak to it. Mara stood up. She explained the water rights filing and what it established. She explained the channel work timeline dates, crew names, specific progress recorded daily. She explained the 2 boundary marker measurements, using her notebook, reading the exact figures she'd written with the hand compass on 2 separate dates, showing the discrepancy between the first and second measurement. Collier objected to the second measurement on the grounds that a ranch cook was not a qualified surveyor. She looked at him. "I'm not presenting a survey. I'm presenting observations, recorded on specific dates, using a standard compass, which show a change in position between 2 visits. The surveyor question matters if I'm establishing the correct position. I'm establishing that the position changed." She looked at Greer. "The inference about why it changed is yours to make, not mine." Greer looked at her over his papers. Then he looked at Halverson. Then back at her. "Continue," he said. She continued. When she sat down, Collier spent 15 minutes trying to discredit the measurement methodology, the channel work timeline, the relevance of the 1,874 filing. He was good at his job. She sat and listened to him and kept her face neutral and her hands still. Then Halverson said quietly, "I'd like to enter one additional piece of documentation." He placed a letter on the table. It was the correspondence from Voss's own county filing, which Halverson had requested through official channels and received 2 days prior. In the filing, Voss's adverse use claim stated that the Northwest Corridor had been used exclusively by the Voss operation, for, and this was the exact phrase, no fewer than 18 years. The Black Hollow Ranch water rights filing was from 1,874. The ranch had been operating for 22 years. The math was not complicated. Collier saw it at the same time Mara did, and she watched something shift in his composure barely, just at the edges, tightening. The expression of a man who had just realized his client's own filing had created a problem he hadn't anticipated. Greer looked at the 2 documents for a long moment. Then he looked at Voss. Voss's face had gone very still. The hearing continued for another 40 minutes, which was mostly procedural, Greer asking clarifying questions, Collier attempting to reframe the timeline inconsistency, Halverson declining to overstate the conclusion, but letting the document speak plainly. At the end, Greer announced he would render his decision within 5 days, but that based on what had been presented, he had significant questions about the timeline validity of the adverse use claim that would need to be resolved before any action could be taken on the Northwest Corridor. It was not a victory, not yet, but it was the hearing going the right direction, which was more than she'd been certain of walking in. In the hallway outside, Cassidy shook Halverson's hand for a long time. Halverson said something quiet that she didn't catch. Caleb stood a few feet away and looked at her, and she looked back at him, and neither of them said anything for a moment. "You were good in there," he said. "The documentation was good," she said. "I just explained it. That's not a small thing." She looked away. Out the window of the courthouse hallway, the main street of Millhaven was ordinary and cold, a few horses at the rail, 2 women in heavy coats moving between storefronts, the absolute normalcy of a world that had no idea what had just happened in the room behind her. "Caleb," she said, "yeah. After the decision comes and after you tell the men, I need to know what you want from this going forward." She turned back to look at him. "What the ranch is doing. What I'm doing in it. I've been working without a clear understanding of the situation, and I'm not willing to keep doing that." He nodded. Not quickly, not the nod of someone agreeing to avoid a difficult conversation. Slowly, like someone acknowledging the full weight of a fair demand. "That's right," he said. "You deserve that." "I'm not asking you to promise me something specific," she said. "I'm asking you to have an honest conversation with me. When the time comes." "Yes," he said. Simple. Direct. "I will." Grier's decision arrived at the ranch 4 days later, carried by a county rider who left it with Cassidy at the gate. It was 3 pages, formal and dense, but the conclusion was plain. The adverse use claim was denied on the basis of timeline inconsistency between the claimant's own documentation and the established property water rights. The Northwest Corridor was confirmed as falling within the Black Hollow Ranch water rights territory, as registered in 1874. Any future claim to the area would require documentation substantially more consistent than what had been presented. The boundary marker dispute was referred to a formal survey, to be conducted within 30 days at county expense, with both properties required to participate. Pending the survey, neither party was to alter any markers in the contested zone. Cassidy read it twice and then handed it to Mara without speaking. She read it, set it down. Pete was standing at the edge of the room. He'd come in from the channel site when he saw the county rider, covered in dirt and cold and still holding a spade. He looked at her. "Well?" "The claim was denied," she said. Pete looked at the paper, then at her, then at the paper again. "That's it," he said. "The survey still has to happen." "But yes, that's the main of it." He made a sound. Not celebration. Pete didn't celebrate, but something. Relief, maybe, filtered through the particular mechanism of a man who expressed relief the same way he expressed everything else. He turned around and went back toward the door, and then stopped with his hand on the frame. "Good work," he said to the door. Then he went back outside. In the quiet after, Cassidy put both hands on the table the way he had in difficult moments, but this time they weren't pressing down. They were just resting there. He looked at the window for a long moment. "I need to tell the men something," he said, "about who owns this ranch." "I know," Mara said. "Caleb wants to tell them himself. Tonight at supper." She nodded. "How are you?" Cassidy asked. He asked it the way people asked it when they meant it rather than as a greeting. Thought about it, honestly. "I'm figuring that out." He nodded slowly. "That seems about right." Supper that evening had the quality of a held breath. Not because anyone knew what was coming. Only Cassidy and Mara knew, and neither of them had said anything. But the men could feel when something was different, the way you felt a change in weather before it arrived. Caleb waited until everyone had eaten. Then he set his fork down, which he never did before everyone was finished, and he looked around the table. He told them plainly. Not with preamble, not with apology, just plainly. Who he was, what he owned, why he'd worked the way he had. He said he'd chosen to work alongside them for the same reasons he'd always had, because he needed to understand what the operation actually was, not what it looked like from a desk, and because men told you the truth differently when they didn't know who you were. The silence that followed was very long. Donovan said, "You're the owner." "Yes." Ferris looked at Cassidy. "You knew." "Always," Cassidy said. Another silence. Skeeter, who had said less in the past 2 months than anyone in the room, said, "Does this change our wages?" Caleb looked at him directly. "Your wages are going up," he said, "for everyone. The ranch's legal position is stronger than it's been in years, and the channel work will open the east pasture for the spring season. I can afford to pay properly now." Nobody said anything to that for a moment. Then Roy from his corner said, "Knew something was off from the start. Man who reads that much isn't just a hand." A few of the men looked at Roy. Old Roy, who almost never spoke, who had been here longer than any of them, who had walked Mara out to the northwest corner, because he'd understood who was actually thinking about the problem. Pete looked at the table. Then he looked at Caleb. "Could have told us." "Yes," Caleb said. "I could have." It was the same answer he'd given Mara, and it carried the same quality, honest, without defense, without asking to be forgiven on grounds of intention. Pete absorbed it, the way Pete absorbed everything working through it, behind a face that showed nothing, chewing on it. Finally, he picked up his cup. "Good thing you hired someone who could read the documents," he said. He looked at Mara when he said it. Not long, but he looked. The table absorbed that, and something in the room shifted in a way she hadn't expected, not dramatically, not with any announcement. Just the slow settling of people, reconfiguring their understanding of the situation they were all in together. 3 days after supper, Caleb found her at the eastern irrigation channel. The crew had finished clearing it the previous week, and she'd gone out to see it for the first time fully open the channel running its original course from the spring connection down through the eastern pasture, the water moving through it slow and clear and cold. It wasn't dramatic, just water finding its old path again. But she'd wanted to see it. He came up beside her and looked at the channel without speaking for a moment. "I wanted to show you something," he said. He handed her a document, took it, and looked at it. It was a formal amendment to the Black Hollow Ranch operational record. A new title, in Halverson's careful legal hand. Manager of Operations and Property Records, Black Hollow Ranch. Her name in the blank. She looked at it for a moment, then at him. "This isn't a cook's position," he said, "and it hasn't been what you've been doing since you got here. I don't know if I want—" She stopped, restarted. "This isn't how I expected things to go." "I know," he was looking at the channel. "I'm not offering it as a trade for anything. It's what the role is, and you're the right person for it. That's the whole of it." He paused. "You can think about it." She looked at the document again. Her name, the ranch's name, the water running through the channel that hadn't run in years. She thought about what it would mean to stay not as the woman who'd arrived with a canvas bag and a torn advertisement, not as the cook who'd been counting beans to make them last, as someone with a defined position, a legitimate authority, a reason that was formal and documented and couldn't be dismissed by anyone who walked through the gate with a folded paper and a smile. She thought about the alternative, which was leaving, going somewhere else, finding another advertisement, starting again at the beginning of something with different people and a different set of problems she didn't know yet. She looked at the water in the channel. "I want to stay," she said. And then, because honesty had been the standard she'd held everyone else to, she added, "I'm not sure what we are to each other. That's still unsettled." "Yes," he said. "I'm not forgiving the withholding because of the title. I know, and I'm not staying because of what I feel about you." She looked at him directly. "I'm staying because this ranch is worth staying for, and because I'm the right person for the work. Those reasons stand on their own." He looked at her steadily. "They do." "But," she said. He waited, the unsettled thing. She folded the document carefully. "I'd like to settle it. Eventually. When we've had more time to be honest with each other without a legal emergency running alongside it." Something in his expression shifted not dramatically. Just the particular stillness of a man who'd been waiting for something and had found it arriving in the specific form it was going to arrive in, not the form he might have imagined. "That seems fair," he said. She tucked the document into her coat. They stood there for a while longer, both looking at the water finding its old path again, cold and clear and purposeful, moving through ground that had been dry for too long. It wasn't a resolution. Not yet. Too many things were still in motion: the survey, the formal documentation, the slow work of rebuilding the operation that the spring and the channels made possible now in ways they hadn't been before. Too many conversations still to have, with each other and with the men, about what the ranch was going to be and who was going to shape it. But the direction was set. The water was moving. The legal position was solid in a way it had not been when she arrived. And Mara Ellison, who had walked through the gate with one trunk and a torn advertisement, and nothing much else to rely on except her own careful attention to the world, was going to stay. Not because she'd been saved or rescued or chosen, because she'd done the choosing herself. The survey team arrived on a Tuesday morning in early March. 2 men from the county land office, carrying equipment that looked more serious than her hand compass, a proper theodolite, measuring chains, a large ledger for recording official findings. They came without announcement, which was standard, and they spent the better part of 2 days working the northwest corner of the property with the methodical patience of men who did this work regularly and had no particular stake in what they found. Mara watched them from a distance on the first day. She didn't hover. She'd done what she could do with the documentation. What the instrument said now was beyond her reach, and she'd learned a long time ago that worrying at something you couldn't affect was a waste of energy that could go somewhere useful. She went back to the kitchen and made bread and did the noon meal and updated the operational log she'd been keeping since Caleb had formalized her role. Caleb watched the surveyors himself. She could see him from the kitchen window in the afternoon, standing well back from their work, arms crossed, not interfering, just present, witnessing. The second day was colder, the kind of cold that arrived in March without warning and reminded you that winter wasn't finished with Wyoming just because you were finished with it. The surveyors worked through it without complaint, which she respected. By late afternoon, they came in to warm up, and Cassidy gave them coffee, and they sat at the kitchen table with their ledger and their notes and didn't share anything about their findings, which was also standard. They left the following morning. The official survey results came back 10 days later. Greer's office sent them directly, a formal document with measurements that superseded all previous informal records. The survey established the northwest corner boundary with precision. The spring access point fell entirely within Black Hollow Ranch property, with a margin of 16 feet from the nearest boundary line. The current position of the boundary marker the post Roy had set in 1878, and someone had of twice since, was found to be 4 feet, 9 inches south of the documented correct position. The discrepancy was noted in the survey record. Its cause was not officially attributed to anyone, but it was documented, which meant it was real, and it meant the correct position was now on record in terms precise enough that no one could move that post again without contradicting official county measurements. Cassidy read the results at the kitchen table with Mara and Caleb on either side of him. When he finished, he set the paper down and looked at nothing in particular for a moment. "That's it," he said. "Almost," Mara said. "There should be a formal notice sent to Voss's lawyer referencing the survey results and confirming that the adverse use claim has been resolved. Halverson can draft it. I'll send word today." Cassidy looked at the document one more time. Then he pushed it toward her side of the table. "You should file this, wherever you're keeping the important papers." She took it. "I'll put it with the water rights filing and the hearing record." "Good." He stood up. He looked at both of them. There was something in his face that might have been emotion if Cassidy had been a different kind of man. As it was just the frank and slightly tired expression of someone who had been holding something heavy for a long time and had just been permitted to set it down. "I'm going to go tell Pete." He went. Caleb was looking at the space where the document had been. Then he looked at her. "You know what this means," he said. "It means Voss has no legal mechanism left," she said. "If he pursues anything after this, he's working against official county records. That's a different kind of fight and a much harder one. He won't pursue it." Caleb said it with the quiet certainty of someone who understood how men like Voss made their calculations. Men like him don't fight losing battles in public. They move on to something else. She thought he was probably right. Voss had resources and other properties and other opportunities. Black Hollow Ranch had been a target of convenience, a smaller operation with unclear documentation, and what had looked like an uncertain legal position. None of that was true anymore. The documentation was thorough, the legal position was solid, and the operation itself was visibly strengthening. There was nothing here left worth the cost of continuing. She nodded, set the survey results carefully to the side. Outside, she could hear Cassidy's voice crossing the yard toward the channel site, where Pete and the crew were doing early spring work on the secondary inlet, the connection from the spring to the holding pond that had been the next project after the eastern channel. She could hear Pete's response, too distant to make out the words, but with a quality she recognized. The sound of a man receiving news that confirmed something he'd been quietly banking on. The holding pond filled for the first time in years onto Saturday in late March. It wasn't a dramatic event. Water didn't arrive all at once. It seeped in slowly through the newly cleared inlet, finding the lowest point of the depression and spreading outward by degrees. By mid-morning, there was a dark patch of wet earth at the center. By afternoon, there was a shallow layer of water covering the bottom, maybe 3 inches deep, reflecting the hard blue sky. All 7 men came out to look at it. Nobody had organized this, they just came, drifting out from their various work by ones and twos, until the whole crew was standing at the edge of the pond in the cold afternoon sun, looking at water in a place that had been dry for as long as any of them except Roy could remember. Roy stood slightly apart from the others. He looked at the water for a long time. Mara stood at the far edge of the pond, where she'd stood the first time she'd found it empty, on that frozen morning before the storm that now felt like a different season entirely. The ground under her boots was soft with the beginning of thaw. The cattail fringe that had been brown and dead was showing the first faint suggestions of green at the base. Jeb came to stand near her. "It's not very deep yet," he said. "It'll take a few days to fill properly," she said. "The inlet flow isn't fast, but it's there, yes. It's there." He was quiet for a moment, this 19-year-old, who'd started the winter unable to look anyone directly in the eye and had ended it giving clear, reliable witness testimony to a county assessor. "When I first got to this ranch," he said, "Pete told me the east pasture was basically useless in dry years. Couldn't run enough cattle on it to justify the maintenance. What does he say now?" Jeb glanced toward Pete, who was standing with his arms crossed on the other side of the pond, looking at the water with his usual expression of a man refusing to be impressed by something that impressed him. He says he wants to run 30 head on the east pasture this summer, Jeb said. I heard him tell Cassidy. She almost smiled. That's a significant change.
Yeah.
Jeb looked at the water. I think a lot of things changed. He said it simply, without the particular weight young people sometimes put on observations they wanted to be recognized as profound. He just said it because it was true, and it was true, and she let it sit without adding anything to it. The conversation she and Caleb had been putting off happened on an April evening, when the temperature had finally shifted enough that the air no longer threatened overnight frost, and the days had lengthened into something that felt like the actual beginning of spring rather than its false starts. He found her at the kitchen table, where else going through the supply records for the spring season. She was calculating what was needed before the summer work began in earnest, which was a different calculation from winter survival, and considerably more optimistic in character. He sat down across from her. She kept working for a moment, finishing the line she was on, and then set at some pencil and looked at him. You've been waiting to have this conversation, she said. So have you. He looked at the table, then at her. I don't know how to do this correctly, he said, which was the most direct thing she'd heard from him, and she'd heard quite a few direct things from him over the past months. I know what I want to say, but I don't have a way to say it that doesn't sound like I'm trying to make something simple that isn't simple. Then say it unsimply, she said. He looked at her for a moment. I want you to stay. Not because of the role, not because of the documentation or the legal record or any of that. I want you to stay because you are the most honest person I have ever had in my life, and I would like more of my life to involve you in it. He paused. That's the unsimple version. She sat with that. And the simple version? She said. I'm in love with you, he said. That's the simple version. Kitchen was quiet. The fire in the stove made its usual small sounds. Through the window, the light was going the particular gold of early spring evenings, the kind that lasted longer now that the season had turned. She looked at him and thought about who he was, not the owner of the ranch, not the man who'd withheld his identity, but the person she'd watched every day for months. The man who knocked on door frames before entering, who read in the evenings and wrote in his careful hand and said things only after he'd thought about them, who'd ridden to Casper in the dark twice without being asked to, who'd stood back and watched the surveyors work without interfering because he understood that some processes had to run their own course, who had told her the truth eventually, even when it was uncomfortable, even when it cost him something. She thought about what she'd said to him at the channel, about the unsettled thing, about waiting until there wasn't a legal emergency running alongside them. The emergency was gone now. What was left was the actual shape of what they were to each other, with no urgency pressing them in any particular direction. I'm not easy to be in a life with, she said. I need to say that plainly. I count things. I notice problems before anyone else sees them, and I can't stop doing that, even when it would be easier for everyone, including me. I don't defer naturally. I don't make myself smaller because the room expects it. She paused. I nearly derailed your legal hearing by saying something to Voss at the gate that wasn't my position to say. It was exactly the right thing to say, he said. That's not the point. I know. The point is you said it anyway. He looked at her steadily. I know who you are, Mara. I've been watching you work for 4 months. I'm not in love with a version of you I'm hoping exists. I'm in love with the actual person in front of me. She felt that land. Not softly, she didn't process things softly but solidly. The way a well-made thing landed when you put it down. If I stay, she said, it has to be as your equal. In everything. Yes. The operational decisions, the documentation, the planning, those aren't favors you extend to me. They're my work. They always were, he said. She looked at him for a long moment. At this man who had made a significant mistake and had owned it without asking to be absolved of it, who had told her the truth when it would have been easier to keep waiting, who was sitting across from her now with the same steadiness he brought to everything, making no promises he couldn't keep and no claims he couldn't back up. All right, she said. He looked at her. All right?
Yes.
She picked up her pencil, not to be dismissive, but because she was herself, and herself included the fact that she had supply calculations to finish. I need 20 more minutes with these numbers, and then we can talk more if you want. There was a pause. Then Caleb Rourke, the owner of Black Hollow Ranch, the quiet man at the end of the table, the person who had ridden in the dark for her twice without being asked, made a sound that was, unmistakably, a laugh. Not a large one, but genuine, the kind that came from somewhere specific, rather than from politeness. "Take your time," he said, and stayed at the table while she finished. By summer, the East pasture was carrying 32 head of cattle. Pete had been right about the number. The water from the restored irrigation system reached the eastern section reliably, and the grass came in better than anyone, except possibly Mara, had anticipated, because she'd noted the soil composition in her early survey of the channel, and had mentioned to Cassidy in passing that the East pasture's poor production in previous years was probably as much about moisture deficit as about the land itself. Cassidy had passed that along to Pete, which Pete had received with the usual response of a man who preferred to verify things himself. And Pete had verified it by watching 32 head graze on grass that had previously supported maybe 15. He didn't say anything to Mara about it directly. He didn't need to. The 32 head said it for him. The holding pond was full by June, a genuine body of water now, the cattails properly green around the edges, the surface reflecting cloud and sky in the mornings before the wind came up. She went out to look at it sometimes when the day's work was done. Not every day, but sometimes. There was something in seeing it that still had the quality of a thing she couldn't quite believe, even though she'd done the calculations herself and known it was possible. It was possible because it had always been possible. That was the thing. The pond had been there the whole time. The spring had been running the whole time. The channels had been there under the debris and the years of neglect. None of it had been created, it had been recovered, seen, and then returned to use. She thought sometimes about what would have happened if she hadn't come. If another woman had answered the advertisement, someone who would have cooked and left in 2 weeks as Cassidy had expected. Voss would have filed his adverse use claim against a ranch whose documentation was incomplete and whose legal position was uncertain, and he probably would have won, or won enough to make the water situation untenable. And Black Hollow Ranch would have become one more operation that sold under pressure to a larger one and disappeared from the county records. It hadn't happened that way. She didn't give herself full credit for that, because full credit was never accurate. Roy had seen the marker. Pete had driven the channel crew. Caleb had ridden in the dark. Halverson had known which documents to enter and in what order. Nothing she'd done had happened alone, but she had done the seeing, and the seeing had been what started everything else. She understood, in a way she hadn't when she was younger, that this was not a small thing. She had spent a significant portion of her life treating her ability to notice and analyze and document as less than the visible physical labor that happened around her, because the world she'd grown up in had a clear hierarchy of what counted as real work and where her kind of work fell in that hierarchy. She'd believed it sometimes, in the way that people believed things they'd been told long enough. She didn't believe it anymore. Cassidy announced his retirement in August. He was going south, he said, to a place in New Mexico territory where he had a sister and where the winters were kinder to his knees, which had been a consistent private complaint for years, and which he'd apparently decided at some point to finally address. He said it without much ceremony, at supper, with the same directness he'd applied to everything since she'd met him. He looked at Mara when he said it, in the way of a man handing something off to the person who should have it. He stayed for another month to transition the operational knowledge that lived in his head rather than on paper, and there was more of that than she'd anticipated, because Cassidy's had been running this operation for 11 years on a combination of written records and accumulated understanding that no document fully captured. Spent 4 weeks following him around and writing things down, which he bore with patience and only occasional mild exasperation. The day he left, he shook hands with every man on the property. When he got to her, he shook her hand and then said quietly, "Just for her, you'll be better at this than I was." She started to deflect and stopped herself. "I'll be different," she said. "Not better or worse. Different." He nodded. That seemed right to him. She watched his wagon go through the gate and felt something she hadn't expected, a genuine grief, small but real. She had not been close to Cassidy in the way of people who spent their evenings in conversation. They had been close in the way of people who respected the same things and worked toward the same goal without needing to discuss it constantly. That kind of closeness was quieter, but it wasn't less. Turned back to the ranch and went back to work. She and Caleb married in October. In the town of Millhaven, with Halverson as a witness and Roy as the other, which was Roy's choice and which she found, when she thought about it, entirely correct. Roy had been on this land for 22 years. He had set the boundary post and noticed when it was moved. He had walked her out in the cold to look at evidence that changed everything. If anyone had a right to witness what the ranch had become, it was him. The ceremony was brief and without ceremony, which suited both of them. She wore a dress she'd ordered through the Casper catalog, dark blue wool, practical for the season, which was as close to a concession to the occasion as she was willing to make. Caleb wore his good coat. He looked at her throughout the proceedings with the same steadiness he brought to everything, and at one point she caught herself thinking that the steadiness was the thing she'd trusted first, before she'd trusted anything else about him, and that this seemed like a reasonable foundation for a life. The men gave them a supper at the ranch that evening. Pete had organized it, which was a fact she knew she would keep thinking about for years. Because Pete organizing a celebration supper for anyone was the kind of thing that made you revise your understanding of a person significantly. The food was not as good as what she produced herself, but it was made with genuine effort, and Jeb burned the biscuits and was visibly devastated about it. And Donovan and Ferris produced a jug of something from an unknown source that Caleb accepted with a straight face, and she declined with what she hoped was an equal straight face. Roy carved something and gave it to her. It was the piece of wood he'd been working since the storm, the one she'd never been able to identify. Turned out to be a bird, wings half open, the kind of carving that was more feeling than representation. She didn't know what kind of bird it was and didn't ask. She set it on the windowsill in the office that was now hers, where it caught the morning light. Winter came again the way Wyoming winters did without apology. This winter, the pantry was fully stocked. The operational record was current and detailed. The boundary survey was filed with the county, and the water rights documentation was complete in a way it had not been a year ago. East Pasture would sustain 30 head through the cold months because the restored water system had allowed the summer grass to deep enough to put the land in better shape than it had been in years. And Gideon Voss, as Caleb had predicted, had moved on to other things. There had been no further communication from his lawyers. His operation had apparently found other water sources or other targets. The details didn't reach Black Hollow Ranch. He was simply gone, the way a pressure released itself when the structure opposing it turned out to be stronger than expected. She thought about him sometimes. Not with anger. The anger had been useful while it was useful, and she'd let it go when it stopped serving a purpose. She thought about him the way she thought about the hard winter and the empty pond and the years of neglect that had left the channels blocked and the documentation incomplete. Not as disasters, as conditions she'd found and worked with. She thought about her father sometimes too. The farm he'd lost, the tools sold at auction. The morning he'd explained to her why they were leaving. She'd been 12 years old, and she'd understood less than she'd thought she did at the time, and more than she'd been given credit for. She'd learned to read documents because of what it cost him not to. She'd learned to count supplies because of what it cost a family not to. She'd learned to look at problems in their full shape, not to be afraid of them, but to map them accurately, because an accurate map of a problem was the first and most important step toward solving one. None of it had been pleasant to learn. None of it came from easy circumstances. But she was here, in a kitchen that was now fully hers, in a ranch that was recovering its strength, in a life she had not planned and could not have imagined, and had nevertheless arrived at through nothing more complicated than paying attention and refusing to stop. That was the thing she kept coming back to. Not the legal hearing. Not the documents. Not the moment Pete said good work to a door. The simpler thing underneath all of it, that the world did not stop having problems that needed to be seen and addressed, and that the people who were willing to see them accurately, not optimistically, not pessimistically, just clearly were always needed more than the world admitted. She hadn't been chosen. No one had told her she was exceptional. She'd walked through a gate and started paying attention and done the next thing that needed doing, and then the thing after that. That was all. That was everything. On a mornings in December, she stood at the kitchen window with her coffee and watched the snow come down on a ranch that was nothing like the one she had arrived at 13 months before. The buildings were maintained now not perfectly, not with unlimited resources, but kept. The fence lines were solid. The livestock were sheltered and well fed. The East Pasture, white and resting under the snow, would come back in the spring with grass that had water reaching it. The holding pond had a skim of ice on it that she could see from here if she looked northwest, which she did sometimes, because she'd found it herself, and the habit of looking toward it hadn't left her. Caleb came into the kitchen and stood beside her at the window. He looked out at the snow without speaking. He didn't need to fill silence with words, which was something she'd been grateful for from almost the beginning. Roy's knee is worse, he said after a while. I know. I've been putting an extra portion aside for him. He won't ask. Pause. Jeb asked about an additional wage for the spring season. He's thinking about staying another year. He should stay, she said. He's become genuinely useful. Caleb looked at her. High praise. It's accurate, she said. He looked back out the window. What do you need this week? For the kitchen. Nothing urgent. I placed the supply order with the Casper rider yesterday. It's in the log. I know, I read it. She looked at him. He had his coffee in one hand and was looking at the snow with the expression he wore when he was simply present in a moment, without needing it to be anything more than it was. She thought about what it meant to love someone. Not in the abstract, she'd never been comfortable in the abstract, but specifically, in her specific case. It meant trusting the steadiness you'd seen in them when everything was uncertain. It meant accepting that honesty was not always comfortable and that you wanted it anyway. It meant standing at a kitchen window in December, both of you knowing the full story of how you got here, and finding that the full story was something you'd rather have than any simpler version. It wasn't a small thing, she thought. The simplest version of it was always easier. The full story required you to carry the hard parts, which were also the parts that mattered. She took a sip of her coffee. Outside, the snow kept coming down on Black Hollow Ranch, soft and steady and indifferent to everything, covering the ground the way snow always covered ground, leaving the shape of the land exactly as it was, only showing it more clearly. She had arrived here with one trunk and a torn advertisement, and a particular way of looking at the world that the world had mostly told her was inconvenient. She had stayed because the work was real, and the land was worth it, and the person beside her was honest enough to deserve honesty in return. She had built something not alone, never alone, but built it nonetheless out of old documents and frozen ground, and 4 men digging a channel in December, and a pond that everyone had forgotten was there. That was the story. Not the dramatic version. Not the version where everything resolved cleanly into the shape a story was supposed to have. The actual version, with its difficulty and its unexpected kindness, and its long stretches of ordinary work between the moments that mattered. She set down her coffee cup. She had operational records to update and a supply list to verify and a noon meal to start. And the snow outside was beautiful in the way that Wyoming snow was always beautiful completely regardless of whether anyone was watching. Turned from the window and went back to work. That was the whole of it. That was enough.